"You will fail within a year without my name behind you," my father sneered, tossing his hot espresso across my printed business plan. The dark liquid ruined months of late-night financial modeling. He signaled for the lobby guards to escort me out, abandoning me on the cold pavement with $0 to my name. 5 years later, I sat in my Manhattan penthouse looking at an urgent email from his chief legal counsel. His real estate empire was drowning in toxic debt, and he was begging my anonymous investment firm for a financial lifeline. He had no idea the ghost entity he was courting was owned by the daughter he threw away. "My name is Chloe. I am 32 years old, and I specialize in hostile corporate acquisitions. Before I show you how I bought my father's legacy for pennies and dismantled his entire reality, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you know that the best revenge is a flawless financial execution." The crystal champagne flute felt cool against my fingers. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, overlooking the glowing New York skyline. My team had just closed a 9-figure buyout, and the room hummed with quiet, focused celebration. My phone buzzed silently against the mahogany desk. I set my drink down and glanced at the illuminated screen. The notification displayed a highly secure incoming transmission directed to the executive inbox of Vanguard Apex, the blind trust I utilized to shield my identity from the market. I opened the message. The subject line read, "Emergency Bailout Request." The sender was the lead attorney for Sterling Legacy Properties. Seeing my family name stamped on a distress signal sent a sharp thrill through my chest. Richard Sterling, a man who built his entire persona on projecting untouchable wealth, was hemorrhaging cash. The attached preliminary prospectus read like a desperate cry for help. I needed a $50 million capital injection within 14 days, or his creditors would force him into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The memory of my expulsion flashed in my mind. Richard had mocked my ambition, calling my understanding of market analytics a childish hobby. He believed daughters were meant to marry well and stay quiet, while his son Preston was groomed to inherit the throne. Now Preston and Richard were steering that exact throne straight off a cliff. I had two choices. I could hit delete, sit back, and let traditional market forces tear him apart. Or I could grant him an audience, let him pitch his desperate lies, and assume the role of his primary executioner. I pressed the intercom button to contact my proxy chief executive officer, a brilliant strategist I paid handsomely to serve as the public face of Vanguard Apex. I told him to accept the meeting for tomorrow morning. I instructed him to play the role of an eager, highly motivated investor, but under no circumstances was he to reveal the true ownership of the fund. Once the meeting was confirmed, I downloaded the financial attachments Richard had provided in his frantic email. I poured another glass of sparkling water and initiated a deep dive into the provided balance sheets. My eyes traced the columns of revenue projections and operational costs. Richard presented a company that was struggling but fundamentally sound, claiming a temporary liquidity crunch caused by shifting interest rates. It took my trained eyes less than 10 minutes to spot the deception. The numbers looked polished, but they were artificially inflated. I isolated the debt schedules and cross-referenced the listed liabilities with recent county property filings. A glaring discrepancy stared back at me. There was a staggering gap between the reported operating expenses and the actual cash flow leaving the corporate treasury. Millions of dollars were unaccounted for in the official ledgers. Richard was hiding a lethal financial secret, a black hole he intentionally omitted from the prospectus. He intended to trap an unsuspecting investor into funding a sinking ship. He thought he was walking into a room to swindle a faceless Wall Street firm. He did not realize he was walking directly into a trap set by the only person on earth who knew exactly how he hid his lies. The executive boardroom of Vanguard Apex was designed to intimidate anyone who crossed its threshold. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the financial district, while a sprawling table carved from a single slab of dark obsidian dominated the center of the room. I sat in a soundproof surveillance suite situated just behind a mirrored glass wall. The digital monitors in front of me displayed multiple high-definition angles of the boardroom. I watched intently as the heavy oak doors swung open. My father Richard strode into the room, projecting the cultivated aura of an untouchable real estate titan. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated generational wealth, his posture rigidly straight. Trailing half a step behind him was Preston. At 35 years old, my brother was the designated heir to the Sterling Empire, a man whose entire resume consisted of unearned promotions and golf club memberships. Preston carried a thick leather briefcase, but his eyes darted nervously around the imposing architecture of the room. He looked less like a corporate executive and more like a cornered animal wearing an expensive watch. Waiting for them at the head of the obsidian table was Julian, my proxy chief executive officer. I had hired Julian specifically for his sharp aesthetic and his ability to follow my exact directives without hesitation. Hidden deep inside Julian's right ear canal was a microscopic receiver linked directly to the microphone resting on my desk. I controlled every word he spoke. Richard offered Julian a firm, aggressive handshake, taking a seat and immediately spreading a series of glossy bound portfolios across the table. These were the financial prospectuses for Sterling Legacy Properties. I adjusted the audio feed, listening to my father's deep, authoritative voice fill the room for the first time in 5 years. He did not hesitate. He launched straight into a highly rehearsed pitch, claiming his firm was on the verge of acquiring a revolutionary commercial plaza in Midtown. He spoke of surging occupancy rates, phantom commercial tenants, paying premium leases, and unprecedented quarterly growth. Richard requested a $50 million capital injection, framing it not as a desperate bailout, but as an exclusive opportunity for Vanguard Apex to partner with a historic dynasty. Listening to his smooth, practiced deception, I felt a familiar, chilling calm settle over my mind. The documents resting on the table were nothing but meticulously crafted ghost reports. As a specialist in hostile acquisitions, I had already run the addresses of his so-called thriving commercial properties through my proprietary algorithms. I knew the Midtown Plaza was currently stalled by severe municipal zoning violations. I knew his phantom tenants were actually empty shell companies registered to a postal box in Delaware. He was presenting a glittering gold mine that was in reality a toxic sinkhole of staggering debt. I pressed the transmit button on my console. "Ask him about the liquidity ratios for the upcoming fiscal quarter," I instructed Julian softly. "Press him on the sudden need for an external equity partner when his own cash flow is supposedly so robust." In the boardroom, Julian leaned forward, interlacing his fingers, and delivered my question word for word. I watched Richard's face on the primary monitor. A fractional tightening of his jaw was the only physical indicator that the question had unsettled him. He quickly recovered, spinning a seamless lie about leveraging new capital to outmaneuver a rival developer. He was attempting to con the fund, aiming to secure the $50 million disbursement, so he could simply siphon the cash and abandon his sinking corporate ship. But my attention drifted away from Richard's theatrical performance. I focused on the secondary camera angle capturing Preston. My brother sat stiffly in his leather chair, his hands resting out of sight beneath the edge of the obsidian table. While his father delivered the pitch of a lifetime, Preston was sweating. A subtle blue light reflected faintly off the polished face of his silver watch. I isolated the camera feed and executed a digital enhancement protocol, zooming in directly on his lap. Preston was gripping a smartphone, his thumbs moving frantically across the screen. He was not taking notes on the negotiation. The high-resolution lens captured the distinct interface of an international banking portal. He was actively inputting a series of complex routing numbers. My eyes scanned the digital text visible on his screen. He was formatting a pending wire transfer to a private holding account located in the Cayman Islands. The pieces of their deceit rapidly clicked together in my mind. This was not a misguided attempt to save their family legacy. This was a premeditated exit scam. Richard and Preston were planning to use the ghost reports to secure the $50 million from Vanguard Apex funnel, the capital into an offshore sanctuary, and vanish before the domestic creditors could freeze their remaining domestic assets. They were conspiring to steal my money and leave their employees and minor shareholders to face the catastrophic fallout. "Let them swallow the hook," I whispered into the microphone. "Tell them the portfolio looks exceptionally promising. Validate his ego." Julian smiled warmly at Richard, nodding in feigned admiration. He closed the prospectus and announced that Vanguard Apex was highly motivated to move forward with the capital injection. Julian promised to have the final term sheets drafted by the end of the week. The wave of relief that washed over the Sterling men was palpable. Richard puffed out his chest, his arrogant superiority returning in an instant. He stood up, buttoning his jacket firmly, believing he had just outsmarted one of the most formidable investment funds on Wall Street. Preston quickly shoved his phone into his pocket, his face breaking into a greedy, triumphant smirk. They shook Julian's hand and turned to leave, entirely blind to the invisible noose tightening around their necks. I watched them walk out of the boardroom and transition to the lobby camera feed. The grand reception area of Vanguard Apex was lined with pristine white marble. Waiting for them near the elevators was the third member of their delegation, a man who had remained excluded from the active negotiation. Marcus stood tall, reading a legal brief on his tablet. He was a brilliant African-American corporate lawyer, a man whose sharp intellect and unyielding integrity had earned him a fearsome reputation in the legal sector. He was also married to my younger sister Lily, out of everyone in the toxic Sterling orbit. Marcus was the only individual who had ever seen through my father's narcissistic facade. When Richard threw me out onto the street 5 years ago, Marcus was the one who quietly paid for my first month of rent in a tiny studio apartment, risking his own standing in the family to ensure I survived the winter. Richard treated Marcus like a convenient legal shield, a polished asset to parade in front of corporate boards, never realizing that his son-in-law despised the very ground he walked on. As Julian escorted Richard and Preston toward the heavy glass doors, Marcus fell into step beside them. The group moved through the bustling lobby, surrounded by busy analysts and passing executives. I watched the screen with clinical precision. Just as they reached the primary exit, a group of interns carrying heavy presentation boards hurried past. In the ensuing brief moment of crowded confusion, Marcus executed a maneuver of flawless, deliberate misdirection. He stepped slightly out of formation, his shoulder intentionally colliding with Julian's arm. "My apologies," Marcus said smoothly, his deep voice carrying over the ambient noise of the lobby. He reached out to steady Julian, a standard polite gesture to anyone observing from a distance. But my high-definition cameras caught the rapid, subtle sleight of hand. During that fraction of a second of physical contact, Marcus pressed his palm against Julian's hand. He seamlessly transferred a small, dark object before stepping back and straightening his tie. Richard and Preston, entirely consumed by their own greedy victory, did not notice a single thing. They walked out of the building confident they had secured their stolen fortune. A minute later, the heavy door to my surveillance suite clicked open. Julian stepped inside, maintaining his professional composure. He walked directly to my desk and opened his closed fist. Resting on the mahogany surface was a sleek black USB drive. It bore no markings, but its presence felt like a ticking explosive device. Marcus had not bumped into my proxy by accident. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew exactly who was pulling the strings behind the mirrored glass. I picked up the drive, feeling the cold metal casing against my skin. The arrogant men who shared my blood thought they had just secured their escape route. They had no idea that the silent lawyer standing in their shadow had just handed the executioner a loaded weapon. The sweeping panoramic view of the New York skyline felt distant as I stood inside my dimly lit penthouse. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass pane window, matching the steady cold rhythm of my pulse. I walked over to my primary workstation, a sleek, customized terminal shielded by military-grade firewalls. I held the unmarked black USB drive Marcus had slipped to my proxy just an hour ago. The metal casing was cold. I inserted the drive into the secure port and initiated a heavily isolated sandbox environment to prevent any potential tracking malware from bleeding into my network. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, executing a deep decryption protocol to crack the biometric lock Marcus had placed on the files. As the progress bar inched forward on the screen, my mind turned to the man who had provided the weapon. Marcus was a formidable corporate litigator, a pragmatic and deeply observant African-American man who navigated the treacherous waters of high society with flawless discipline. When he married my younger sister Lily 5 years ago, my father Richard treated the union as a convenient public relations maneuver. Richard loved to parade Marcus at charity galas, to project a progressive corporate image, yet behind closed doors, he frequently dismissed Marcus's legal advice with thinly veiled condescension. Richard assumed Marcus was merely a grateful participant, enjoying the elite Sterling lifestyle. He profoundly underestimated his son-in-law. Marcus possessed an intellect that easily outmaneuvered the entire Sterling bloodline. He endured the subtle insults at family dinners and the arrogant dismissals in the boardroom because he was playing a brilliant silent long game. He saw the structural rot consuming the real estate empire long before anyone else. His primary objective was protecting Lily from the inevitable collapse. Marcus knew Richard would eventually try to drag Lily down into the financial wreckage, using her assets as a human shield. This encrypted drive was his insurance policy. He was serving his toxic father-in-law to the wolves to guarantee his wife's survival. The screen flashed a crisp green confirmation. The encryption shattered. A labyrinth of internal corporate data flooded my monitors. Hidden ledgers, unredacted bank statements, and private executive email threads cascaded across the display. I pulled up my forensic accounting software and fed the raw data into the analytical engine. I expected to find inflated revenue projections. I expected to see manipulated property appraisals and hidden commercial debt. I did not expect to uncover a sprawling, meticulously organized federal crime scene. I isolated a series of recurring transactions flagged by my software. They were buried deep within the Human Resources Payroll Directory, intentionally mislabeled as standard operational overhead. I traced the digital routing numbers, peeling back the layers of corporate camouflage. The money was not flowing outward to vendors or contractors. It was being systematically diverted from the Employee Benefits Trust. My breath caught in my throat as the sheer scale of the deception materialized on the screen. Richard had established a shadow routing protocol within the payroll software. Every 2 weeks, the company deducted retirement contributions from the paychecks of hundreds of employees. Those hardworking project managers, receptionists, and site supervisors believed their money was safely compounding inside their 401k accounts. They trusted the company. Richard was betraying that trust with every single payroll cycle. Instead of remitting the withheld funds and the promised corporate matching contributions to the designated retirement trust, he funneled the capital into a ghost holding account. This was not a minor accounting error. This was a direct, undeniable violation of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. Under United States federal law, raiding employee pension funds is a devastating felony. The Department of Labor and the Internal Revenue Service do not negotiate when fiduciaries steal from the working class. They pierce the corporate veil, seize personal assets, and hand down prison sentences measured in decades. I ran a swift summation script on the stolen funds. Richard had siphoned over $30 million from his own loyal staff. The burning question was where the money had gone. A failing real estate company might steal to cover legitimate construction delays, but the outflow ledgers painted a far more sinister picture. I followed the money trail, leaving the ghost account. The stolen retirement funds were split into 2 primary financial arteries. I tracked the first artery directly to a series of offshore holding companies located in Cyprus and the Isle of Man. I cross-referenced the account ownership records and found Preston's digital fingerprints all over the transfers. My arrogant brother was not a sharp investor. He was a catastrophic gambling addict. The ledgers revealed millions of dollars wired to international sports betting syndicates and high-stakes underground casinos. Preston had racked up insurmountable debts, and Richard was actively looting the life savings of his employees to keep foreign loan sharks from breaking his son's legs. The second financial artery flowed much closer to home. It fed directly into a private checking account controlled entirely by Victoria, my stepmother. Victoria was a woman who masked her deep insecurities behind a veneer of suffocating elitism. She spent her days attending charity luncheons and demanding respect from a society that merely tolerated her. The stolen funds financed her desperate illusion of royalty. I reviewed the itemized statements linked to her account. There were 6-figure charges for Parisian haute couture, exorbitant fees for private jet charters to exclusive wellness retreats, and multi-million-dollar acquisitions of contemporary art. Victoria was sipping rare vintage champagne and expanding her jewelry collection using the stolen retirement money of the very people who fetched her dry cleaning. A cold, heavy realization settled into my chest. The temperature in the penthouse seemed to drop. I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair, staring at the damning evidence glowing on my monitors. The $50 million pitch Richard delivered in my boardroom just hours ago took on a horrifying new dimension. He was not just asking Vanguard Apex for a financial lifeline to save his real estate empire. He was deploying a Trojan horse. In the realm of corporate mergers and acquisitions, buying a company means acquiring its history. If my blind trust stepped forward and officially purchased Sterling Legacy Properties, the acquisition would include an assumption of liabilities clause. Vanguard Apex would legally inherit the fiduciary duty of the looted retirement trust. Richard was handing me a ticking federal explosive. He intended to secure the $50 million bailout, quietly resign from the board, and flee to a non-extradition country with Victoria and Preston. He wanted my faceless investment firm to take the fall when the federal government inevitably audited the empty pension accounts. He planned to leave the buyer holding a $30 million federal indictment. A sharp, lethal smile touched the corners of my mouth. Richard believed he was the smartest predator in the ecosystem. He thought he could outmaneuver an anonymous Wall Street titan. He had no idea he was dealing with the daughter he had trained to be ruthless. I leaned forward and closed the acquisition prospectus. I would not buy his toxic company. I refused to act as a human shield for his federal crimes. But I was not going to let him walk away unpunished. If he wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial ruin, I was going to rewrite the rules entirely. I opened the secondary debt schedules Marcus had thoughtfully included in the encrypted drive. I bypassed the standard commercial mortgages and the municipal bonds. I hunted for the shadow debt, the desperate, unregulated loans. Richard kept off the official balance sheets to hide his impending insolvency. I found it buried on page 47 of a highly restricted liability ledger. 8 months ago, Richard had secured a $10 million mezzanine loan from Shadow Capital. I knew that specific organization very well. They were a notoriously ruthless private equity syndicate, a firm of corporate loan sharks operating in tailored suits. They specialized in lending fast, unregulated cash to desperate founders at extortionate interest rates. Their contracts were infamous for containing hair-trigger acceleration clauses, allowing them to demand the entire principal immediately upon a single missed payment. A loan of that magnitude required ironclad collateral. Since the commercial properties were already heavily mortgaged to traditional banks, Richard had to look elsewhere to guarantee the $10 million. I opened the collateral annex attached to the Shadow Capital loan agreement. My eyes scanned the legal text, and a surge of pure, icy adrenaline coursed through my veins. To secure the dirty money, Richard had pledged his personal residential assets. The legal document listed the sprawling Manhattan penthouse, where Victoria hosted her extravagant galas. It listed the sprawling Hamptons estate where Preston spent his summers pretending to be a self-made titan. Richard had literally mortgaged the roofs over their heads to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be a king. The strategy crystallized in my mind with pristine clarity. I did not need to buy the company to destroy them. I only needed to control the ground they slept on. The mezzanine loan was a blunt instrument of total devastation, and I intended to wield it. I picked up my secure phone, ready to reach out to the sharks at Shadow Capital. I was going to purchase that specific junk debt, assume the role of the primary secured creditor, and hold the power to evict my treacherous family onto the street. The glowing screens of my command center cast a pale blue light across the dark penthouse. I picked up my secure encrypted phone and bypassed my standard contact list, navigating straight to a heavily guarded directory of shadow financiers. I was entering a financial battlefield where corporate ethics did not exist, a subterranean market where predatory lenders traded the carcasses of failing companies. My target was Victor Thorne, the managing partner of Shadow Capital. Victor was a notorious distressed debt broker operating out of a heavily fortified office in Lower Manhattan. He thrived on desperation, issuing high-interest loans to arrogant executives who had exhausted their traditional banking options. He was the man holding the $10 million noose tightly around my father's neck, and I intended to buy the rope. I routed the call through 3 international proxy servers, ensuring the caller identification displayed the anonymous corporate crest of Vanguard Apex. The line rang twice before a sharp, grating voice answered. "State your business," Victor demanded, skipping any semblance of a professional greeting. He sounded rushed, the chaotic ambient noise of a trading floor echoing faintly behind him. "My name is Victoria, representing Vanguard Apex," I stated, pitching my voice into a cold, uncompromising register. "I am calling regarding the $10 million mezzanine note you currently hold on Sterling Legacy Properties. I understand the founder is bleeding cash, and I am prepared to offer you an immediate exit strategy. A sharp, cynical laugh crackled through the speaker. You Wall Street vultures are always circling the same dying animals. Victor sneered. Richard Sterling is a dead man walking. He missed his last interest payment by 48 hours. My legal team already drafted the Uniform Commercial Code foreclosure notices. I am filing the injunctions at the federal courthouse tomorrow morning at 8. I am going to seize his Manhattan penthouse, liquidate his Hamptons estate, and strip his firm down to the copper wiring. Why would I sell that paper to you? Because you are a debt broker. Victor, not a real estate agent. I countered smoothly, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. You deal in fast liquidity, not protracted property management. Seizing those estates requires evicting a highly litigious family. It requires paying exorbitant carrying costs, property taxes, and maintenance fees while the assets sit on a stagnant market. You will tie up $10 million of your operating capital in probate court for years just to realize a marginal profit. Victor remained silent for a few seconds. The aggressive posturing faded slightly, replaced by the cautious calculation of a predator assessing a rival. I knew his business model intimately. Shadow capital survived on rapid turnover. Trapping their capital in a messy, prolonged legal siege was their greatest operational vulnerability. I am listening, Victor said, his tone dropping to a serious, guarded pitch. I am offering you clean, untraceable liquidity right now, I continued, tightening the psychological grip. But you need to understand the true toxicity of the paper you hold. Richard Sterling did not just mismanage his real estate portfolio. He crossed a fatal line. My auditors uncovered severe irregularities, indicating he raided his own employee pension funds. I let the weight of that revelation settle over the encrypted line. Victor was a shark, but even sharks fear the federal government. If you file those foreclosure notices tomorrow morning, you will alert the Department of Labor and the Internal Revenue Service. I explained, delivering the financial reality check with surgical precision. Federal regulators do not respect private equity liens when investigating pension fraud. They will invoke civil asset forfeiture. They will freeze the Manhattan penthouse and the Hamptons estate as the proceeds of a federal crime. Your collateral will be locked in a government evidence vault before you can even schedule an auction. You will walk away with zero. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the receiver. Victor realized he was holding a ticking explosive device. The arrogance evaporated, leaving only raw, pragmatic greed. What is your offer? Victor asked, the desperation finally bleeding into his voice. I checked the digital clock on my primary monitor. The negotiation window was shrinking, and I needed to establish total dominance. You have exactly 20 minutes to accept this term sheet. I stated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Vanguard Apex will purchase the $10 million note, including all attached collateral covenants and personal guarantees, for $3 million cash, 30 cents on the dollar. $3 million! Victor shouted, his anger flaring up again. That is highway robbery. The real estate alone is appraised at over 15. I will not take a $7 million haircut just because you suspect a federal audit. $5 million, or I take my chances with the regulators. I did not negotiate. I did not raise my voice or offer a compromise. I utilized the most terrifying weapon in corporate warfare: absolute silence. I let the dead air stretch between us. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. The silence forced Victor to sit alone with his fear. He had to visualize the federal agents raiding the Sterling offices. He had to picture his $10 million investment vanishing into a government seizure protocol. He knew I was offering his only viable escape hatch. You have 18 minutes left, Victor. I finally whispered, my voice slicing through the tension like a razor. If the clock expires, Vanguard Apex withdraws the offer permanently. You can try explaining to your investors why you chose to gamble their money against the United States Department of Labor. Fine, Victor spat the word, carrying the bitter taste of defeat. Send the assignment of debt contracts to my secure portal. You get your signature when the $3 million hits my holding account. If the wire bounces, the deal is dead. I disconnected the call without offering a polite farewell. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, initiating the pre-drafted legal documents. I transferred $3 million from my untraceable offshore reserve directly into the Shadow Capital escrow account. The banking interface processed the transaction with blinding speed. The progress bar flashed green, confirming the transfer of funds. Moments later, the incoming secure portal chimed. Victor had executed his end of the bargain. I downloaded the digital packet and opened the heavy legal files. The documents bore the official digital notary stamps verifying the transfer of ownership. I scrolled through the dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning the specific collateral schedules. There was the deed of trust for the Manhattan penthouse. There was the lien on the Hamptons estate. And there were the personal guarantor signatures of Richard and his pampered wife, Victoria. By signing my name on the final execution line, the transition of power became a binding legal reality. The transaction was flawless. Vanguard Apex was now the undisputed primary secured creditor of the Sterling Empire. I owned the roof over my father's head. I owned the floors he walked on. If he missed a single payment, or if he breached a single covenant of the toxic loan, I possessed the unilateral authority to cast him out onto the pavement. A profound, chilling satisfaction radiated through my chest. 5 years ago, Richard had thrown his coffee at my business plan and declared me a worthless failure. He told me I could never survive the brutal reality of the financial sector. He had no idea the daughter he discarded had just purchased his entire existence for pennies on the dollar. I saved the executed contracts to a fortified offline drive, securing the instruments of my revenge. The board was set. The legal traps were armed. I leaned back, preparing to savor the victory, but the quiet hum of my penthouse was abruptly shattered by a blaring, high-pitched siren emitting from my secondary monitor. The screen flashed a brilliant, pulsing crimson. The automated security protocols I had quietly embedded within the Sterling internal network had just triggered a critical severity alarm. I rolled my chair toward the flashing monitor, my eyes narrowing as I quickly deciphered the incoming data stream. Someone was attempting a massive unauthorized capital extraction from the primary Sterling operating account. I bypassed the visual alerts and dropped directly into the command line interface, pulling the live routing data. The digital footprint belonged to Preston. My brother was currently logged into a secure executive terminal at the corporate headquarters. He was bypassing the standard accounting protocols, utilizing an emergency executive override to access the company's final liquid reserves. My pulse quickened as I watched the keystrokes register in real time. Preston was formatting a wire transfer for exactly $5 million. It was every single remaining cent of operating cash. The company possessed the very funds required to meet payroll and keep the lights on for another week. I traced the destination routing numbers he was inputting. He was not sending the money to a vendor or a domestic creditor. He was routing the $5 million directly to a newly established, heavily obfuscated shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Preston and Richard were not waiting for the Vanguard Apex bailout to fail. They knew the ERISA violations were a ticking time bomb. They realized the federal government was closing in, and they were executing an emergency evacuation protocol. Preston was stealing the last remnants of the corporate treasury to fund their escape planning to leave the entire collapsing structure, including the innocent employees, to shoulder the devastating legal fallout. If that $5 million crossed international waters and landed in the Cayman accounts, they would vanish. They would live comfortably in exile, escaping the ruin they had manufactured, while I was left holding a portfolio of distressed debt tied to a deserted crime scene. I grabbed my secure keyboard, my eyes locked on the glowing red progress bar, indicating Preston's transaction status. The wire transfer was pending final authorization. I had seconds to construct a digital barricade and trap the rats inside the sinking ship before they could abandon the crew. The elevator doors glided open silently, revealing the private foyer of the Sterling Manhattan penthouse. The air smelled faintly of expensive lilies and the sharp metallic tang of impending desperation. I smoothed the lapels of my midnight blue suit, my posture radiating the cold, uncompromising authority I had honed over 5 years of corporate warfare. I did not ring the bell. I simply grasped the heavy brass handle and pushed the door open, stepping into a space that had once been a prison of suffocating expectations. The sprawling, formal dining room was illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier. Seated around the polished mahogany table were the architects of my former misery. Richard sat at the head, attempting to project patriarchal dominance despite the frantic sweat pooling at his temples. Victoria, draped in an ostentatious silk gown, purchased with stolen pension funds, sat to his right, her face pinched in a tight, anxious mask. Preston hovered near the sideboard, clutching a tumbler of scotch, his eyes darting erratically, visibly reeling from the offshore transfer freeze. And then there was Lily, seated rigidly across from Victoria. She looked incredibly fragile, her shoulders hunched as she stared down at a thick stack of legal documents resting on the pristine table linens. Marcus stood directly behind her chair, a silent, formidable sentinel in a tailored suit, his jaw clenched as he monitored the psychological assault unfolding before him. My entrance broke the tense atmosphere like a gunshot. The conversation died instantly. 5 pairs of eyes snapped toward the doorway. Victoria let out a sharp theatrical gasp, a hand flying to her chest. Richard slammed his fist onto the table, half rising from his chair, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing loudly across the dining room. "You were explicitly banned from this property 5 years ago. Who let you up here? Security is supposed to screen all visitors." I ignored his outburst entirely. I walked smoothly into the room, the sharp click of my stilettos measuring out a steady, unyielding rhythm against the hardwood floor. I bypassed the empty chairs and positioned myself near the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a commanding view of the city skyline and a perfect vantage point to observe their impending self-destruction. I heard there was a mandatory family gathering tonight. I stated, my voice eerily calm, completely devoid of the panic or subservience he expected from the daughter he had discarded. I thought it only appropriate to drop by and see how the sterling legacy is holding up under pressure. Victoria sneered, her initial shock rapidly transforming into venomous contempt. "Look at you," she mocked, gesturing dismissively with her manicured hand, trying to play the successful businesswoman. "Did you rent that suit to impress us? You are nothing, Chloe. You failed at building your little startup, and now you are crawling back here looking for a handout because you are starving. Get out before we have you arrested for trespassing." I offered her a brief, chilling smile. "I assure you, Victoria, I am not the one currently starving for capital. But let us not focus on my wardrobe. Let us focus on why you drag your youngest daughter out on a rainy evening and place a home equity loan application squarely on her dinner plate." Lily flinched, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She had always been the peacekeeper, the daughter who desperately tried to navigate the emotional minefield our parents meticulously laid. Richard recognized my interference and immediately shifted his tactics, dropping the overt hostility and adopting a sickeningly sweet, manipulative tone aimed directly at Lily. "Do not listen to her, sweetheart," Richard coaxed, reaching across the table to tap the legal documents. "Chloe is just bitter because she lacks the vision to understand high-level corporate finance. This loan is a minor temporary bridge. Sterling Legacy Properties is experiencing a slight liquidity bottleneck due to some aggressive expansion maneuvers. We just need $2 million to cover payroll and operational costs for 14 days. Once the massive Vanguard Apex acquisition closes next week, I will repay the loan with interest. You are securing the family empire, Lily. You are saving our legacy." Preston, slurring slightly from the scotch, chimed in, attempting to bolster the lie. "It is a sure thing, Lily. The Vanguard deal is a lock. Just sign the papers. We are all making sacrifices for the greater good here." Marcus placed a steady, reassuring hand on Lily's shoulder. He did not yell. He did not engage in a screaming match. He wielded his legal expertise with surgical precision. "You are not signing anything," Lily Marcus stated, his deep voice slicing cleanly through Richard's manipulative garbage. "I reviewed these documents. This is not a simple bridge loan. This is an aggressive, high-interest home equity line of credit that fully leverages our Brooklyn property. Furthermore, the corporate guarantee clause is deliberately vague. If Sterling Legacy defaults, the bank seizes our home immediately. We will be out on the street and your father will bear zero personal liability." "How dare you speak to me like that in my own home?" Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You are a guest at this table, Marcus. I brought you into this family. You owe me respect. This company provides the status that allows you to walk into those elite courtrooms. You will not stand there and instruct my daughter to betray her own blood." Marcus did not blink. He stared down his father-in-law with absolute, unyielding contempt. "I owe you absolutely nothing, Richard. and I will not allow you to use my wife's pristine credit to plug the massive holes in your sinking ship. The answer is no. The house is entirely off limits. Find another victim to fund your incompetence." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Richard realized his primary source of emergency capital was slipping through his fingers. The panic he had been desperately suppressing finally boiled over. He stood up, fully towering over the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at Lily. "If you do not sign those papers right now, you are dead to me," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "You hear me? I will disinherit you completely. You will be cut out of the trust. You will never see a single dime of the Vanguard buyout money. I will erase you from this family, just like I erased your useless sister." Lily began to cry quietly, the emotional abuse finally taking its toll. Marcus immediately pulled her up from the chair, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. He did not bother offering a rebuttal to the empty threats. He simply guided her away from the table, shielding her from the toxic fallout. "We are leaving," Marcus announced, turning his back on the screaming patriarch. He shot me a brief, knowing glance before escorting Lily toward the foyer. The heavy front door clicked shut behind them, severing their ties to the fraudulent empire forever. I remained standing near the window, a silent spectator to the spectacular implosion. Richard slumped back into his chair, breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he stared at the unsigned loan documents. Victoria was frantically texting on her phone, likely trying to locate a pawn shop willing to accept stolen art. Preston poured himself another generous measure of scotch, entirely defeated by the realization that his Cayman Islands escape route was closed and his domestic bailout had just walked out the door. The silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating. They were cornered rats, trapped in an elegant cage of their own making. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the window, preparing to make my exit. I had witnessed exactly what I came to see. I watched them cannibalize each other, exposing the absolute moral bankruptcy that defined their existence. But before I left, I needed to plant the final seed, a carefully calibrated comment designed to inflate Richard's towering ego to its absolute maximum capacity before I shattered it completely. I paused near the archway leading to the foyer, adjusting my cuffs with feigned nonchalance. I turned back to face my father, offering him a look of mild, detached curiosity. "I heard a rather interesting rumor buzzing around the financial sector this afternoon," I said casually, my voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "Word on the street is that a major private equity firm, Vanguard Apex, is preparing to inject $50 million into your struggling operation. Is that the legendary acquisition you were screaming about just now?" Richard's head snapped up. The mention of the bailout instantly resurrected his arrogant facade. He genuinely believed I was a failed entrepreneur, gazing enviously at his impending massive success. The desperate, panicked man vanished, replaced by the smug, condescending patriarch who had thrown coffee in my face 5 years ago. "Word travels fast when you are orchestrating the deal of the century," Richard boasted, puffing out his chest and smoothing his ruined tie. "Yes, Vanguard Apex is finalizing the paperwork as we speak. They recognize true market dominance. While you are scrounging for pennies in whatever pathetic job you manage to secure, I am about to secure a $50 million capital infusion. I will be richer and more powerful than ever before." Victoria smirked, leaning into the lie. "You should have taken notes, Chloe. Maybe you would not be such a spectacular failure if you had learned how to properly negotiate with the big players." I offered them a slow, incredibly sharp smile. The irony was so dense it was practically suffocating. They were bragging about their glorious future, completely unaware that the executioner was standing in their dining room, holding the freshly signed assignment of debt contracts in her briefcase. "Congratulations, Richard," I said, my voice dripping with lethal satisfaction. "I am sure Vanguard Apex will provide you exactly what you deserve. Enjoy the rest of your evening." I turned and walked out of the penthouse, the heavy doors closing softly behind me. Let him sleep soundly tonight, dreaming of his $50 million salvation. Let him believe he had outsmarted the entire financial system. The higher he allowed his ego to soar, the more devastating the impact would be when I inevitably cut the cord. The dawn broke over Manhattan in hues of cold steel and bruised purple. I sat at my command terminal, the glow of multiple monitors reflecting off my face. The acquisition of Shadow Capital's toxic debt was secure. I owned my father's primary liabilities, positioning Vanguard Apex as the apex predator in the impending corporate slaughter. The board was set for absolute destruction. Then the secure encrypted line linking directly to Marcus began to flash rapidly. I hit the receiver icon immediately. Marcus rarely utilized the emergency channel unless a situation had escalated beyond standard legal maneuvering. "Chloe, we have a critical breach," Marcus stated, his deep voice stripped of its usual calm resonance, replaced by a raw, urgent intensity. "Preston just executed a catastrophic maneuver. What happened?" I demanded, my fingers instantly hovering over the keyboard, ready to deploy countermeasures. "I watched you walk out of the penthouse. You refused the home equity line. The collateral was denied. We refused the primary loan application," Marcus clarified, the anger simmering palpably beneath his words. But Preston did not need our physical presence to orchestrate a theft. He needed liquidity desperately to mask the blocked offshore transfers. He circumvented the standard banking channels. He accessed a secondary high-risk commercial lending portal, utilizing his executive credentials at Sterling Legacy Properties. I leaned forward, my analytical mind racing ahead to anticipate the mechanics of the fraud. To secure a commercial loan of that magnitude without liquid corporate assets, he needs a guarantor, a clean, unencumbered asset. "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. And because Richard's properties are already heavily leveraged, Preston utilized a blank surety bond template he kept on file from a previous legitimate real estate transaction. Lily co-signed 3 years ago. He digitally forged Lily's signature onto the new commercial bond. He explicitly cross-collateralized our Brooklyn brownstone to secure a $2 million emergency operating loan for his father's company. The sheer staggering audacity of the crime momentarily paralyzed my breathing. Preston had not merely attempted to steal from the company treasury, he was actively committing severe identity theft and federal mortgage fraud against his own sister. He was willing to render Lily and Marcus entirely homeless simply to buy Richard enough time to close the Phantom Vanguard deal. "Did the lender approve the disbursement?" I asked, my tone dropping to a lethal, precise register. "The underwriting algorithm granted preliminary approval based on Lily's immaculate credit score." Marcus explained, the frantic clicking of his own keyboard echoing through the secure connection. "The funds are currently sitting in escrow. The lender is preparing to record the finalized lien against our property with the county clerk. If that document is officially registered and filed with the court, the lien becomes legally binding. If Richard's company defaults, which we know is imminent, the bank will bypass probate and seize our home immediately. We will be tied up in litigation for years trying to prove the forgery." "How much time before the county clerk processes the filing?" I asked, bringing up the municipal registry database on my secondary monitor. "The digital processing window typically closes at 10:00 a.m., Marcus replied. "I am preparing an emergency injunction to halt the registration, but navigating the bureaucratic red tape might take hours we do not possess. We need to strike the fraudulent document directly from the lender's queue before it hits the municipal server. I will handle the digital extraction," I assured him, executing a secure tunneling protocol to mask my IP address. "Do not file the injunction yet. If you alert the court, you tip off Preston that we know about the forgery. I want him to believe his criminal lifeline is still perfectly intact until I snap the trap shut." "Understood." Marcus agreed, recognizing the tactical advantage of sustained deception. "Erase the bond, Chloe. Do whatever it takes." I disconnected the call and focused entirely on the digital battlefield. I needed to infiltrate the specific commercial lending portal Preston had utilized. It was a mid-tier aggressive lending institution that prized speed over rigorous compliance, a vulnerability I intended to exploit ruthlessly. I deployed a sophisticated packet-sniffing algorithm, targeting the lender's external communication gateways. I wasn't attempting to breach their heavily fortified central financial vault. I was targeting the administrative holding queue, the digital waiting room where approved documents sat before being automatically forwarded to the county clerk for official registration. My software hammered against the superficial firewalls, executing a rapid sequence of SQL injections designed to bypass standard authentication protocols. The lender's security architecture was robust, but it was designed to repel brute force financial theft, not surgical document extraction. Within 4 minutes, my screen flashed a vibrant green confirmation. I had successfully penetrated the administrative holding queue. I swiftly navigated the directory searching for the specific surety bond linked to Sterling Legacy Properties and Lily's forged signature. The document was flagged for expedited processing, sitting dangerously close to the top of the transmission list. The digital timer indicated it was scheduled to be pushed to the municipal server in exactly 12 minutes. I highlighted the fraudulent file. With a single decisive keystroke, I executed a complete unrecoverable deletion protocol. I did not merely move the file to a digital trash bin. I scrubbed the data packets entirely, erasing the forged surety bond from existence. The malicious lien that threatened to destroy my sister's sanctuary evaporated into digital dust. To ensure Preston remained oblivious to his failure, I generated a dummy file, a harmless corrupted data packet, and inserted it into the queue in place of the deleted bond. When the lender's automated system attempted to process the document, it would encounter an inexplicable rendering error, delaying the disbursement of the $2 million indefinitely, while the IT department scrambled to diagnose the glitch. The threat was neutralized. Lily's home was secure. I leaned back, taking a slow sip of cooling coffee, allowing a brief moment of satisfaction to wash over me. The Sterling men were flailing blindly, executing increasingly desperate illegal maneuvers to stay afloat, completely unaware that I controlled the very currents they were drowning in. Before terminating my covert connection to the lender's administrative server, I initiated a routine sweep of the peripheral data traffic, searching for any other anomalies connected to the Sterling accounts. It is a fundamental rule of forensic auditing. When one rat attempts to flee a sinking ship, others are usually scurrying in the shadows. A highly encrypted email flagged by my peripheral sweep caught my attention. It was not routed through the standard corporate servers. It originated from a private, heavily anonymized account, but the recipient address belonged to a boutique, ultra-exclusive logistics firm specializing in the secure transport of high-value antiquities and fine art. I intercepted the encrypted packet and ran a rapid decryption script. The text of the email populated on my monitor, revealing a communication that was both chillingly pragmatic and entirely indicative of my stepmother's true nature. The sender was Victoria. The message was an urgent, highly confidential directive instructing the logistics firm to dispatch a specialized night crew to the Manhattan penthouse. The directive explicitly commanded the secure packaging and immediate removal of a specific, incredibly valuable asset, a rare authenticated Picasso painting that Richard had purchased years ago during a brief period of legitimate profitability. The painting was widely known to be valued at upwards of $8 million. Victoria wasn't merely preparing to abandon her failing husband. She was orchestrating a massive covert heist of the family's most liquid, untraceable asset. She intended to spirit the Picasso out of the penthouse under the cover of darkness, likely planning to fence the masterpiece on the black market to fund her own luxurious escape before the federal authorities froze the estate. She was actively stripping the copper wire from the walls before the building collapsed. I stared at the screen, a cold, predatory smile forming on my lips. Victoria believed she was cunning, silently looting the sinking ship, while Richard and Preston frantically tried to plug the holes. She assumed her midnight art heist would go entirely unnoticed amidst the impending corporate chaos. She had absolutely no idea that she had just handed the primary secured creditor the exact coordinates of her escape vehicle. The intercepted email detailing Victoria's midnight art heist glowed brightly on my monitor. The audacity of her betrayal was staggering yet entirely predictable. Victoria operated on a foundation of pure, unadulterated self-preservation. She had married Richard for the illusion of impenetrable wealth, enduring his insufferable arrogance solely for the societal access it afforded her. Now that the facade was cracking, revealing the hollow debt-ridden reality beneath, she was executing a ruthless, unilateral exit strategy. She intended to steal the $8 million Picasso, a masterpiece that technically constituted a primary asset of Sterling Legacy Properties. She planned to abscond with the canvas fence it through untraceable channels and vanish into a comfortable, wealthy exile, leaving Richard to face the federal indictments alone. I did not reach for my phone to alert the authorities. Contacting the police regarding a domestic dispute over marital property would merely result in a tedious, protracted civil investigation. It would freeze the asset in an evidence locker, rendering it useless to my broader strategy. I was not a distressed family member seeking justice. I was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex, the undisputed primary secured creditor of the Sterling Empire. That Picasso did not belong to Richard, and it certainly did not belong to Victoria. It belonged to me. I opened my secure legal portal interfacing directly with the specialized asset recovery team I kept on permanent retainer. These were not standard corporate attorneys. They were aggressive, highly efficient legal operators who specialized in the immediate physical seizure of distressed collateral. I transmitted the Intercepted Logistics Directive and the authenticated assignment of debt contracts demonstrating Vanguard Apex's overriding lien on all Sterling assets, including high-value personal property housed within the encumbered Manhattan penthouse. Draft an emergency writ of attachment. I instructed the lead recovery attorney via a secure text channel. I need a localized judicial signature authorizing the immediate impoundment of the specified artwork. Do not alert the debtor. Deploy the tactical recovery unit to the loading dock of the Sterling penthouse at exactly 1:00 a.m. The attorney responded within 30 seconds. Right drafted. Securing the judge's signature now. The recovery team is mobilizing. I leaned back, visualizing the impending collision. Victoria believed she was executing a stealthy, flawless escape. She had no idea she was coordinating the logistics for my repossession team. As midnight approached, the city that never sleeps settled into a muted electric hum. I remained stationed at my command terminal, accessing the municipal traffic cameras positioned near the service entrance of the towering residential building housing the Sterling penthouse. At 12:45 a.m., an unmarked climate-controlled transport van pulled quietly into the loading bay. The vehicle lacked any identifying logos, a deliberate choice by the boutique logistics firm Victoria had hired to ensure absolute discretion. Two men clad in dark, nondescript uniforms stepped out, moving with practiced efficiency toward the service elevator. I switched my view to the interior security feed of the penthouse foyer, a feed I had covertly compromised days ago. Victoria stood near the heavy oak doors, dressed in an immaculate dark traveling suit, her face a mask of tight, nervous anticipation. She held a sleek designer handbag, undoubtedly packed with her passport, untraceable jewelry, and the initial funds necessary to facilitate her disappearance. She paced the marble floor, checking her watch repeatedly, waiting for the transport crew to arrive and secure her stolen $8 million ticket to freedom. The service elevator chimed softly. The two transport specialists emerged, pushing a heavy-duty padded art crate. Victoria quickly ushered them toward the formal living room, directing them toward the massive abstract Picasso dominating the primary wall. She stood back, her arms crossed, watching intently, as the men carefully dismounted the masterpiece, securing the frame within the custom crate. The operation was swift and silent. They sealed the crate, loaded it onto the dolly, and maneuvered it back toward the service elevator. Victoria followed closely, her posture radiating the triumphant relief of a rat successfully abandoning a sinking ship. They descended to the loading bay. I shifted my attention back to the exterior traffic cameras. As the service elevator doors opened on the ground floor and the transport crew rolled the crated Picasso toward their unmarked van, a sudden blinding array of high-intensity floodlights illuminated the dark alleyway. Three heavily armored black SUVs bearing the discreet but unmistakable insignia of Vanguard Apex Asset Recovery had silently blockaded the loading dock exit. The trap was sprung. 6 recovery agents wearing sharp tactical suits and earpieces stepped out of the vehicles, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. They instantly formed an impenetrable perimeter around the transport van and the crated artwork. Victoria froze, her triumphant relief instantly evaporating, replaced by a shock so profound she visibly staggered backward. The transport crew, recognizing the overwhelming display of legal force, immediately stopped moving the dolly and raised their hands in a gesture of non-interference. The lead recovery agent, a formidable woman projecting absolute authority, stepped forward. She did not yell. She did not draw a weapon. She wielded a power far more devastating than physical force. She produced a thick, legally binding folder stamped with the bright red seal of the New York State Supreme Court. Victoria Sterling, the agent, announced, her voice echoing sharply in the confined loading bay. We represent Vanguard Apex, the primary secured creditor, holding the overarching lien on all assets associated with Sterling Legacy Properties. We are executing an immediate court-ordered writ of attachment. The artwork contained within this crate is officially seized as distressed collateral. Victoria stared at the agent, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her mind entirely incapable of processing the catastrophic reality unfolding before her. "You cannot do this!" Victoria finally shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "That painting is my personal property. It is not corporate collateral. You are stealing from me. I will call the police." The recovery agent remained entirely unmoved by the hysterical outburst. She extended the legal folder, forcing Victoria to look at the documentation. "You are welcome to contact local law enforcement, ma'am," the agent replied, her tone dripping with clinical detachment. "However, the police will merely verify the authenticity of this judicial order. Furthermore, removing a high-value asset from an encumbered property in the middle of the night, particularly an asset pledged against a defaulted commercial loan, constitutes severe bankruptcy fraud and illegal dissipation of assets. If you attempt to interfere with this lawful seizure, we will formally report your actions to the federal authorities overseeing your husband's corporate audits." The threat of federal prosecution instantly silenced Victoria. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking haggard and utterly defeated. She realized with sickening clarity that her flawless escape plan had been entirely dismantled. She was not leaving with $8 million. She was leaving with absolutely nothing, trapped in the crosshairs of a ruthless corporate creditor she did not even comprehend. The recovery agents seamlessly took possession of the dolly, rolling the crated Picasso away from the stunned transport crew and securing it within the armored Vanguard Apex vehicle. The operation was completed in less than 5 minutes. The SUVs reversed out of the alleyway, disappearing into the New York night, carrying away Victoria's stolen future. I watched the live feed as Victoria stood alone in the damp, dimly lit loading bay, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. She had attempted to betray her husband, only to be ruthlessly outmaneuvered by an invisible adversary. Her desperation, however, was far from exhausted. When a predator loses its primary kill, it immediately searches for an alternative, more vulnerable source of sustenance. The next morning, the financial markets opened with their usual chaotic energy, but inside the Sterling penthouse, the atmosphere was a toxic pressure cooker of silent panic and unspoken betrayals. I maintained my surveillance, tracking the digital communications flowing in and out of the residence. Richard had retreated to his home office, frantically trying to reach the phantom Vanguard Apex executives to finalize the phantom $50 million bailout, entirely unaware that the firm had already stripped his walls bare. Victoria, enraged by the loss of her Picasso and terrified of the impending financial collapse, initiated her secondary survival strategy. She needed cash immediately to fund her escape, and she knew precisely who possessed the liquidity to provide it. My monitors alerted me to a highly restricted text message dispatched from Victoria's personal phone directed squarely at Preston. The message was not a request. It was a blatant, aggressive extortion demand. "I know exactly what you did." Preston, the text read the words radiating pure malice across the screen. "I saw the bank notifications. I know you forged Lily's signature on the commercial surety bond to secure that emergency $2 million loan. You committed severe federal mortgage fraud against your own sister." I watched Preston's reaction via the hidden office camera. He was sitting at his desk, bleary-eyed and sweating, still reeling from the frozen offshore transfer. He read the text message, his entire body going rigid. The realization that his stepmother possessed irrefutable knowledge of his felony crime paralyzed him. A second message immediately followed the first, delivering the killing blow. "You have until noon today to wire $3 million into my personal offshore account." Victoria demanded her extortion absolute. "If the money does not clear, I am taking the proof of your forgery directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I will personally hand them the evidence that will put you in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. Do not test me, Preston. Pay me, or I destroy you." The digital extortion demand glowed on my screen, a testament to the utter moral decay rotting the core of the Sterling family. Victoria was ruthlessly squeezing her stepson, demanding $3 million he fundamentally did not possess. Preston was trapped in a financial vice, caught between the frozen offshore funds, the imminent collapse of his father's empire, and the terrifying prospect of a 20-year federal prison sentence for mortgage fraud. I watched his reaction through the hidden camera in his office. Panic is a potent catalyst, often driving desperate men to execute catastrophic miscalculations. Preston began pacing frantically, running his hands through his hair, his mind undoubtedly spinning through a rapid succession of impossible solutions. He could not access the corporate treasury. It was drained and under intense scrutiny. He could not secure another fraudulent loan. His credit was radioactive. He needed immediate, untraceable liquidity, and he needed it before noon. When a corporate executive lacks capital, they inevitably turn to the only remaining asset they control: proprietary information. Sterling Legacy Properties, despite its massive debt and structural instability, still harbored significant inherent value. Richard had spent decades cultivating a highly exclusive, fiercely guarded database of ultra-high net worth international clients, foreign dignitaries, and silent investors who preferred to operate in the shadows of the real estate market. Furthermore, the firm possessed proprietary, highly advanced predictive modeling software designed to identify undervalued commercial sectors before they hit the public market. This core technology and the VIP client registry were the crown jewels of the Sterling empire. If those assets were compromised or sold, the company's valuation would instantly plummet to zero, rendering the corporate shell entirely worthless. Preston stopped pacing. He sat heavily in his leather chair, a dark, desperate resolve hardening his features. He pulled out a secondary encrypted burner phone, a device separate from the corporate network I was actively monitoring. However, Preston's technological ineptitude was a known variable. He failed to realize that the acoustic sensors I had covertly installed in his office were highly sensitive, capable of capturing even hushed conversations. I boosted the audio feed, listening intently as he placed a heavily disguised call. "I have the complete registry," Preston whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "The full VIP client list, including the offshore escrow accounts and the proprietary predictive modeling source code. I need $5 million in unmarked cryptocurrency transferred to my private wallet within 2 hours." The silence on the other end of the line was palpable, followed by a low, murmured response. Preston was negotiating with a phantom, attempting to fence the lifeblood of his father's company to a direct competitor. Fine, Preston conceded, his desperation evident. $3 million. But I need the transfer executed immediately. I will bring the encrypted hard drives to the designated location at 11. He disconnected the call, leaning back in his chair, exhaling a long, shaky breath. He believed he had found his salvation, a quick, dirty transaction that would satisfy Victoria's extortion demand and perhaps leave him with enough residual capital to orchestrate his own escape. He was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality he had just created. If Preston successfully finalized this illicit sale, he would completely eviscerate the foundational value of Sterling Legacy Properties. The company would become an empty, worthless husk. My carefully constructed financial trap, built upon the acquisition of the mezzanine debt, relied on the inherent value of the corporate assets to leverage absolute control. If Preston sold the proprietary data, he would effectively detonate the bomb before I could position Richard in the blast radius. I could not allow the transaction to proceed. I needed to intercept the sale, secure the proprietary data, and simultaneously capture irrefutable evidence of Preston's corporate treason. I immediately initiated a secure trace on the outgoing burner phone signal, deploying a rapid geolocation algorithm. The data parsed quickly, pinpointing the recipient of Preston's desperate call. The number belonged to a high-level executive at Orion Global, a notoriously aggressive cutthroat real estate syndicate known for utilizing highly questionable tactics to crush its competitors. Orion Global was the perfect buyer for stolen corporate secrets, but their involvement provided me with a distinct tactical advantage. I had previously orchestrated a massive covert restructuring of Orion's primary debt obligations through Vanguard Apex. They owed their continued solvency to my anonymous firm, a fact their senior leadership understood implicitly. I picked up my secure phone, dialing the direct line of Orion Global's chief executive officer. "I require a favor," I stated, bypassing any pleasantries, my voice carrying the uncompromising authority of a major creditor. "Your acquisitions team just received an illicit offer from Preston Sterling regarding stolen proprietary data. You will proceed with the scheduled meeting, but you will alter the parameters. I will be attending the negotiation as your primary risk assessment specialist. You will provide me with a secure room, full digital surveillance capabilities, and absolute autonomy over the transaction." The Orion CEO did not hesitate. He recognized the tone and understood the unspoken threat. When the entity holding your financial lifeblood makes a request, compliance is the only viable response. The arrangements are being finalized. Now the CEO confirmed, his voice tight with professional deference. "The meeting is scheduled for 1100 a.m. at our secondary off-site facility in Soho. We have prepared a secure partitioned conference room equipped with one-way glass and full-spectrum recording devices." "Excellent," I replied, terminating the connection. I walked to my closet, shedding the midnight blue suit from the previous evening. I needed a different armor for this specific engagement, an aesthetic that projected clinical analytical detachment. I selected a tailored slate gray blazer, stark white blouse, and sleek, minimalist frames that subtly altered my facial structure. I pulled my hair back into a severe, uncompromising style. I looked exactly like a ruthless corporate risk assessor, a woman whose sole purpose was to evaluate liabilities and minimize exposure. At 10:45 a.m., I arrived at the Orion Global Off-Site Facility, a nondescript, heavily fortified building designed for highly sensitive corporate negotiations. The Orion executive team escorted me directly to the secure conference room. The setup was flawless. The room was divided by a massive pane of one-way mirrored glass. On one side sat a long, stark table equipped with high-resolution microphones and hidden camera lenses. On the other side, shrouded in complete darkness, was my surveillance post. I took my seat in the shadows, adjusting the audio monitors and initiating the digital recording protocols. At precisely 11:00 a.m., the heavy door to the conference room opened. Preston walked in, clutching a sleek aluminum briefcase to his chest, as if his very life depended on it. He looked terrible, exhausted, terrified, and vibrating with a manic, desperate energy. Two senior Orion executives entered shortly after taking their seats across from him. They maintained a cold, professional demeanor, playing their assigned roles perfectly. "Let us dispense with the formalities," Preston stated, his voice cracking slightly as he placed the briefcase on the table. He was eager to conclude the transaction, terrified that Richard or Victoria might discover his absence. Inside this case are two encrypted solid-state drives. They contain the complete, unredacted Sterling VIP client registry, including offshore holding structures and historical investment profiles. The second drive holds the source code for our proprietary predictive market modeling algorithm. The Orion executives exchanged a calculated glance. "That is highly sensitive data, Preston. Acquiring this information crosses several significant legal boundaries. Our risk assessment department requires absolute certainty regarding the validity and exclusivity of these files." Preston scoffed, a desperate, arrogant sound. "I am the Vice President of Sterling Legacy Properties. I have unfettered administrative access to the central servers. I downloaded these files personally this morning. They are authentic and they are exclusive. You will possess the keys to our entire market share." I watched from behind the mirrored glass, my finger resting on the recording toggle, ensuring every single word of his confession was captured in pristine, high-definition audio. "And your asking price?" the lead Orion executive inquired, leaning forward, playing the negotiation perfectly. $3 million. Preston demanded, his desperation bleeding through his aggressive posture. "Transferred immediately into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. I have the routing protocols ready. Once the transfer clears, I will provide the decryption keys for the drives." The Orion executive paused, tapping his pen against the table intentionally, letting the silence stretch, amplifying Preston's rising panic. "We need to verify the contents before we authorize a disbursement of that magnitude. We need to run a preliminary diagnostic on the drives." Preston hesitated, his paranoia warring with his desperate need for the funds. He knew that handing over the drives without payment was incredibly risky, but the ticking clock of Victoria's extortion demand left him with zero leverage. "Fine." Preston conceded, snapping the locks on the briefcase open. He slid the 2 solid-state drives across the table. "You have 5 minutes to verify the headers. Then the transfer executes, or I walk." The Orion executive picked up the drives, plugging them into a secure, isolated terminal resting on the table. The screen illuminated, displaying the highly classified proprietary file structures. Preston had delivered exactly what he promised. He had laid the entire Sterling empire bare, offering its most valuable secrets to a bitter rival for a fraction of their actual worth. I sat in the darkness, the faint blue glow of the recording monitors reflecting in my eyes. I had captured everything. I possessed the undeniable, irrefutable evidence of Preston actively engaging in corporate espionage, attempting to sell highly classified proprietary data belonging to his father's firm. This was not a simple white-collar misdemeanor. This was a severe federal crime, a blatant violation of the Economic Espionage Act, carrying penalties that included massive fines and extensive federal prison sentences. Preston had believed he was executing a clever, desperate maneuver to save himself from Victoria's blackmail. He thought he was outsmarting his family and outmaneuvering the financial collapse. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the very weapon I needed to ensure his complete, uncompromising destruction. The recording was flawless. The trap was set. Now I just needed to deliver the evidence to the one man who would ensure Preston suffered the maximum possible devastation. The high-definition recording of Preston's treason was securely encrypted and resting comfortably on my secure server. The digital guillotine was primed, but releasing it now would be premature. I needed Richard fully committed, entirely locked into the illusion of his $50 million salvation before I dropped the blade on his son. I left the Orion Global facility, the slate-gray blazer, feeling like perfectly tailored armor, and returned to my command center. The digital timer on my primary monitor was relentlessly counting down. The Shadow Capital mezzanine loan, the toxic debt I had acquired, was officially in default. The legal machinery required to seize Richard's personal assets was fully armed, but I needed him to voluntarily construct his own corporate tomb before I executed the foreclosure. I initiated a secure connection to Julian, my proxy CEO, at Vanguard Apex. "It is time to close the trap," I instructed, my voice sharp and decisive. "Finalize the $50 million capital injection agreement for Sterling Legacy Properties. Send the contract to Richard's legal team immediately. Ensure Clause 42 remains exactly as I drafted it." "Understood." Julian replied, his tone professional and obedient. "I will dispatch the documents within the hour." Clause 42 was the poison pill meticulously designed to bypass corporate shielding and attach massive liability directly to Richard. In standard mergers and acquisitions, an acquiring firm typically assumes the debts of the target company. However, Clause 42 was a highly aggressive reverse indemnification covenant, explicitly titled Assumption of Absolute Liability. The clause stated that by accepting the $50 million disbursement, Richard Sterling, as the managing partner, personally and unconditionally guaranteed the veracity of all provided financial disclosures. More importantly, it stipulated that if any undisclosed, hidden, or fraudulent liabilities were subsequently discovered, the acquiring fund, Vanguard Apex, possessed the unilateral right to instantly recall the $50 million injection. Furthermore, the clause mandated that Vanguard Apex could immediately seize any and all corporate assets to satisfy the resulting deficit, bypassing standard probate or bankruptcy protections. It was a financial bear trap, specifically designed to catch a man who believed he was clever enough to hide $30 million in stolen pension funds. I monitored the digital correspondence as Julian transmitted the massive legal file to the Sterling corporate headquarters. The reaction was almost instantaneous. Within 45 minutes, Richard's lead corporate counsel, a seasoned, cautious attorney named Harrison, initiated an urgent conference call with Julian. I listened via the covert audio feed, anticipating the legal pushback. "Julian, this contract is highly irregular." Harrison stated, his voice tight with professional anxiety. "Clause 42 is draconian. It essentially strips away all corporate liability protections. You are asking my client to personally guarantee the financial disclosures with an immediate unilateral clawback provision. If a minor accounting discrepancy is found, Vanguard Apex could theoretically seize the entire operational structure of Sterling Legacy Properties. We cannot advise our client to sign an agreement containing an assumption of absolute liability. Julian, following my exact script, remained perfectly calm and unyielding. Harrison Vanguard Apex is offering a $50 million lifeline to a firm that is currently experiencing severe liquidity bottlenecks, Julian countered smoothly. We are willing to inject massive capital, but we require absolute assurance that the financial landscape is exactly as Mr. Sterling presented it. If the ledgers are clean as your client insists, then Clause 42 is merely a formality, a standard safeguard for our investors. If Mr. Sterling is unwilling to stand behind his own numbers, perhaps Vanguard Apex should reconsider the acquisition entirely. The threat of withdrawing the $50 million was the ultimate leverage. I watched the surveillance feed in Richard's office as Harrison relayed the ultimatum. Richard paced furiously, his face flushed with a volatile mixture of anger and desperation. He needed that $50 million to mask the ERISA violations and fund his offshore escape. The ticking clock of the federal audits was deafening in his ears. "They are bluffing," Richard snapped, slamming his hand against his mahogany desk. "They want the real estate portfolio. They are just trying to strong-arm us into a subordinate position. Tell them we refuse Clause 42. Harrison shook his head, his expression grave. "Richard, they are not bluffing." Julian made it explicitly clear. "The $50 million is contingent upon this specific clause. If you sign this and they discover the irregularities in the pension ledgers, they will bypass the corporate shield. They will seize the company, and they will likely report the fraud to the SEC to protect their own standing. You are legally volunteering for the firing squad." Richard hesitated. The arrogant facade cracked, revealing the panicked, cornered criminal beneath. He was weighing the immediate guaranteed destruction of defaulting on the shadow capital loan against the theoretical delayed destruction of signing the Vanguard contract. He needed a push, a final catastrophic pressure that would force him to abandon logic and embrace raw, blind greed. I leaned over my keyboard, preparing to deliver the final catalyst. I accessed a secure, untraceable terminal and drafted a highly credible anonymous tip. I targeted a prominent, notoriously aggressive financial news blog, a platform famous for breaking Wall Street scandals and initiating market panics. The tip was meticulously constructed. It did not mention the stolen pension funds or the toxic mezzanine debt. It focused entirely on market stability. I leaked verified localized data indicating that Sterling Legacy Properties had silently defaulted on 3 minor commercial construction loans in the past 48 hours. Furthermore, I included a highly plausible rumor suggesting the New York Stock Exchange was actively reviewing the firm's listing status due to severe undocumented liquidity failures. I hit send, releasing the rumor into the digital ecosystem. The financial markets operate on perception and panic. Within 20 minutes, the blog published the breaking alert. The headline blared across trading terminals: "Sterling Legacy Properties facing imminent delisting amidst severe liquidity crisis." The impact was immediate and devastating. The stock price, already fragile, began to plummet in real time. I watched Richard's office feed as the news broke. His phone began ringing incessantly, a relentless chorus of panicked investors, furious board members, and demanding creditors. The carefully constructed illusion of his wealth was disintegrating on live television. Harrison pointed frantically at the television screen mounted on Richard's wall, broadcasting the financial news network, analyzing the sudden collapse. "Richard, the stock is in free fall," Harrison yelled over the ringing phones. "If the NYSE halts trading, the firm is dead by the closing bell. We have no leverage left." Richard stared at the plunging ticker, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow and rapid. The panic finally overwhelmed his rational survival instincts. He saw the $50 million from Vanguard Apex not as a trap, but as his only remaining life raft. He believed he was smarter than the contract. He believed he could secure the funds, transfer the money offshore, and vanish before Vanguard Apex even realized the pension funds were missing. He thought he could outrun the liability. "Print the contract," Richard ordered, his voice hoarse, devoid of its usual booming authority. "Print the damn contract right now." Harrison hesitated, his legal ethics warring with his client's disastrous command. "Richard does strongly advise against this. You are signing a financial death warrant. I said print it. Richard roared, his face contorted in a mask of desperate fury. If I don't sign this, we are bankrupt by noon. I will not lose my empire to a rumor. I will take their $50 million, and I will fix this. Harrison, recognizing the futility of arguing with a drowning man, reluctantly pulled the document from the printer. He placed the thick-bound contract on the desk, highlighting the signature line on the final page, directly beneath Clause 42, Assumption of Absolute Liability. Richard did not bother reading the fine print. He did not review the aggressive clawback provisions or the immediate seizure protocols. He was entirely blinded by the promise of $50 million. He snatched his expensive gold fountain pen from his desk organizer. With a swift, arrogant, and incredibly foolish motion, Richard slashed his signature across the document, legally and irrevocably binding himself to the catastrophic terms I had meticulously designed. He tossed the pen onto the desk, letting out a sharp, breathless laugh of triumphant relief. He looked at the signed contract, a smug, victorious smile slowly spreading across his face. He genuinely believed he had just outsmarted one of the most formidable investment funds in the city. He thought he had secured the capital necessary to cover his tracks and fund his escape. He thought he had won. I sat in my penthouse watching him smile through the hidden camera. A cold, profound satisfaction settled deep into my bones. He had not secured a lifeline. He had just voluntarily, eagerly, and legally signed his own financial death warrant. The $50 million was a ghost, and the trap was now permanently, inescapably locked. The tires of Richard's luxury sedan screeched against the pavement as he swung into the drop-off zone outside the towering glass facade of the Vanguard Apex building on Wall Street. He did not bother with the valet. He threw the keys at a startled doorman and stormed through the revolving doors, Preston trailing closely behind, mirroring his father's frantic, desperate aggression. The pristine marble lobby of the financial firm hummed with the quiet efficiency of billion-dollar transactions. Richard shattered the sophisticated atmosphere instantly. He bypassed the reception queue, marching directly toward the imposing security desk. "I demand to see the chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex." Immediately, Richard roared, slamming his open palm against the polished granite counter. The sharp sound echoed through the cavernous lobby, drawing the startled attention of several passing analysts. "You tell Julian or whoever is running this fraudulent operation that Richard Sterling is here, and I am not leaving until my $50 million is returned to my accounts." The head of security, a broad-shouldered man projecting calm professional authority, stepped forward. He did not reach for his radio or attempt to de-escalate the situation with corporate platitudes. He had received highly specific, pre-authorized instructions regarding the arrival of these particular individuals. "Mr. Sterling," the security chief stated evenly, gesturing toward a private bank of elevators, "the executive board is anticipating your arrival. Please proceed directly to the primary boardroom on the 60th floor." Richard scoffed, interpreting the immediate compliance as a sign of weakness. He assumed his aggressive posturing had sufficiently intimidated the firm's leadership. He adjusted his suit jacket, shooting a triumphant glare at Preston. "They know they overstepped," Richard muttered as they stepped into the private elevator. "They realize I will drag this entire firm into federal court if they do not reverse the seizure. We walk in there, we demand the capital, and we leave." The elevator ascended rapidly, a silent, pressurized ascent, carrying them toward the apex of the building. The steel doors glided open, revealing a sweeping corridor lined with frosted glass walls. They marched down the hall, their heavy footsteps muffled by the thick sound-absorbing carpet. They reached the heavy double doors of the primary boardroom. Preston pushed them open with unnecessary force. The room was vast, dominated by the massive obsidian table where the initial bailout negotiations had occurred. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a vertigo-inducing perspective of the financial district below. However, the room was conspicuously empty of the bustling legal teams and junior partners Richard expected to confront. Julian, the proxy CEO they had interacted with previously, was nowhere to be seen. At the far end of the long obsidian table, positioned directly beneath the expansive windows, sat a single high-backed leather executive chair. The chair was turned away from the entrance, facing the sweeping view of the city, presenting only a broad leather back to the furious men entering the room. "I am not playing games today," Richard bellowed, marching toward the center of the room. I do not care what loophole you think you found in Clause 42. You orchestrated a hostile seizure of $50 million. You will initiate a reverse wire transfer this exact second, or my legal team will file an emergency injunction that will freeze every single asset Vanguard Apex holds globally. Preston stood beside his father, nodding aggressively, attempting to project a menacing aura he entirely lacked. We have the resources to bankrupt this firm. Preston added, his voice cracking slightly with residual panic. The heavy leather executive chair did not respond immediately. The silence in the room stretched thick and suffocating, contrasting sharply with their frantic shouting. Then the chair began to slowly, deliberately rotate. The polished ball bearings hissed faintly against the hardwood floor. The high back swung around, revealing the individual occupying the ultimate seat of power within Vanguard Apex. I sat there, my hands resting calmly on the armrests, dressed in a sharply tailored slate gray suit that radiated uncompromising authority. I did not glare. I did not smile. I looked at the two men standing before me with the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a mathematically flawed ledger. The psychological impact of the revelation struck them with catastrophic force. Richard halted mid-stride, his polished leather shoes freezing against the floorboards. The aggressive momentum propelling him forward vanished instantly. The color drained from his face with terrifying speed, leaving his complexion a sickly, translucent white. His jaw went slack, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as his brain violently rejected the visual data it was receiving. Preston stumbled backward, physically recoiling as if he had been struck. He bumped into the edge of the obsidian table, gripping the polished stone to keep his trembling legs from giving out entirely. The woman they had banished from their lives, the daughter Richard had gleefully predicted would fail within a year without his prestigious name, was not a struggling entrepreneur. She was the anonymous titan who had systematically dismantled their entire empire. She was the predator who owned their debt, controlled their assets, and held their financial execution orders in her manicured hands. Chloe Richard finally gasped, his voice a ragged, hollow whisper that barely carried across the vast boardroom. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. What? What are you doing sitting in that chair? Where is the CEO? I am the CEO. Richard. I stated, my voice echoing with absolute lethal clarity in the silent room. Vanguard Apex is a blind trust. It is my firm. I own the $50 million you desperately tried to steal. I own the $10 million mezzanine loan you defaulted on. And as of this morning, I legally own the very floor you are currently standing on. The reality of the situation crashed over Richard, a tidal wave of realization drowning his towering arrogance. He was not dealing with a faceless Wall Street conglomerate. He had walked directly into a meticulously engineered trap constructed by the child he despised. The anger he felt regarding the seized funds rapidly morphed into a desperate, pathetic attempt at manipulation. He reverted to the only tactic he knew, asserting a warped, toxic paternal authority. "You cannot do this," Richard shouted, his voice rising in pitch, cracking under the immense strain of his impending ruin. "I am your father. You are my daughter. You cannot seize $50 million from your own flesh and blood. You have to give that money back to the company immediately. We are family. Chloe, you owe me that capital." He took a frantic step toward me, reaching out with both hands as if he could physically pull the money from my grasp through sheer parental entitlement. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer a defensive rebuttal. Engaging with his emotional manipulation would merely validate his delusion. Instead, I reached forward and pressed a small, discreet button embedded in the surface of my desk. A sharp electronic click resonated through the boardroom. The heavy double doors they had barged through simultaneously sealed shut, the magnetic locks engaging with a definitive, inescapable thud. They were physically locked inside the execution chamber. At the same moment, the massive blank wall spanning the length of the boardroom flickered to life. A state-of-the-art high-definition projection screen illuminated the space, bathing Richard and Preston in a harsh, clinical white glare. "I do not owe you capital." "Richard," I said softly, my voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "But I do owe you transparency regarding exactly why your company is currently worthless." The massive screen fractured into a complex multi-window display. The visual evidence of their decades of corruption populated the wall in undeniable, glaring detail. The left quadrant of the screen displayed the internal human resources ledgers I had decrypted from Marcus's USB drive. The data highlighted the massive systematic withdrawal of funds from the employee 401k trust accounts. I projected the routing numbers, tracing the stolen pension money directly into the offshore gambling syndicates Preston frequented, and the private luxury accounts controlled by Victoria. "You stole $30 million from the people who built your buildings," I narrated, ensuring they understood the depth of my knowledge. "You committed federal ERISA violations to fund Preston's betting addiction and Victoria's designer wardrobe." Richard stared at the scrolling ledgers, his chest heaving as the undeniable proof of his felony crimes was broadcast in high definition. He looked at Preston, sheer panic replacing the anger in his eyes. The right quadrant of the screen activated. The visual shifted to the high-resolution covert video recording I had captured the previous day at the Orion Global facility. The video played silently, but the imagery was devastatingly clear. Preston sat in the dimly lit conference room, sliding the encrypted solid-state drives across the table to the rival executives. The screen displayed the exact moment Preston handed over the proprietary predictive algorithms and the sterling VIP client registry in exchange for a promised $3 million cryptocurrency transfer. Preston let out a choked, terrified sob. He clamped his hands over his mouth, backing away from the screen until he hit the locked boardroom doors. He realized his father was watching him commit corporate treason. "You attempted to sell the core assets of this firm for scrap to cover Victoria's extortion demands," I stated, turning my gaze to my trembling brother. "You committed economic espionage. You provided the physical evidence required for a 20-year federal sentence." The two men stood in the locked boardroom, surrounded by the undeniable, perfectly documented evidence of their total moral and financial bankruptcy. The illusion of their elite status was incinerated. They were no longer real estate titans. They were cornered criminals staring at a lifetime in federal prison. I sat back in my leather chair, watching the reality of their destruction settle over them. The trap was fully deployed, but the execution required one final devastating component to guarantee their permanent eradication from the financial ecosystem. The visual evidence glaring from the massive screens acted as a potent accelerant on Richard's already volatile psyche. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life dictating reality to those around him, manipulating facts and bending people to his will. Confronted with unassailable, highly documented truth that exposed his criminality and incompetence, his fragile ego shattered entirely. The denial evaporated, replaced by a raw, unhinged, and dangerous fury. He lunged forward. The distance between the obsidian table and my desk vanished in 3 massive, aggressive strides. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, primal rage, the veins pulsing erratically against his collar. He raised his hands, curling them into tight, trembling fists, his intention clear. He intended to physically assault the daughter who had dared to dismantle his empire. I did not flinch. I did not attempt to stand or retreat. I remained perfectly seated, my posture unwavering, my gaze locked onto his furious eyes. I knew the architecture of this room, and I knew I was not unprotected. Before Richard could close the final gap, a towering figure materialized from the shadows near the secondary entrance of the boardroom. Marcus moved with the fluid, explosive speed of a man highly trained in both physical confrontation and corporate warfare. He stepped smoothly between me and the charging patriarch, planting his feet firmly and raising a single authoritative hand. The physical barrier he presented was absolute. "Step back." Richard Marcus commanded, his deep baritone vibrating with a lethal, barely contained intensity that halted Richard's momentum instantly. "If you lay a single finger on her, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your pathetic life drinking through a straw in a federal penitentiary." Richard staggered backward, blinking rapidly, utterly disoriented by the sudden appearance of the son-in-law he had always treated with dismissive contempt. The presence of Marcus in the inner sanctum of Vanguard Apex was a profound shock, a jarring contradiction to the narrative Richard had constructed. Marcus Richard sputtered, his voice cracking, the anger fracturing into profound confusion. "What are you doing here? You work for me. You are part of Sterling Legacy." Marcus adjusted his cuffs, his expression radiating absolute unfiltered disdain. "I have never worked for you, Richard," he clarified, his voice sharp and precise. "I tolerated your arrogant presence to protect my wife. But as of this morning, I have officially assumed my true position. I am the chief legal counsel for Vanguard Apex." The revelation was a devastating psychological blow. Richard realized the depth of the infiltration. His own family, the people he believed he controlled with an iron fist, had quietly orchestrated a highly coordinated, flawlessly executed insurgency. Chloe and Marcus stood together, an impenetrable alliance forged in the fires of Richard's toxic abuse. Marcus did not offer Richard time to process the betrayal. He approached the obsidian table carrying a thick, heavy leather binder. He dropped the binder onto the polished stone with a resonant, booming thud that echoed like a judge's gavel. He opened the binder and began extracting a series of freshly stamped, legally binding documents, sliding them precisely across the table toward Richard and the cowering Preston. "You signed the assumption of absolute liability." Richard Marcus stated, his legal mind shifting into high gear, weaponizing the very contract Richard had so eagerly embraced. "You authorized Vanguard Apex to unilaterally seize any and all assets to satisfy the resulting deficit caused by your fraudulent disclosures. We are formally executing those seizures right now." Marcus tapped the first document. "This is a court-approved writ of execution for the Manhattan penthouse. The deed of trust has been formally transferred. The locks have already been changed by our property management team. You no longer have a residence in the city." He slid a second document forward. "This is the impound authorization for the corporate vehicle fleet, including Preston's customized sports car. The vehicles were towed from the executive garage 15 minutes ago." He presented the final, most devastating document. "And this," Marcus concluded, pointing a steady finger at the paper, "is the immediate asset freeze order placed on all personal banking accounts tied to your Social Security number, including the private checking account utilized by Victoria. Vanguard Apex has successfully reclaimed every single dollar of liquidity you possessed to partially offset the stolen pension funds." Richard stared blindly at the documents. The staggering magnitude of the financial annihilation finally registered. He was entirely destitute. He possessed no home, no transportation, and absolutely no capital. The empire he spent decades building on a foundation of lies was completely, officially liquidated. He was a beggar standing in an expensive, useless suit. Preston, who had remained huddled against the locked doors, finally broke. The reality of the seized assets and the glaring video evidence of his corporate espionage crushed whatever remaining loyalty he harbored for his father. Preston was a coward, fundamentally incapable of accepting responsibility or enduring hardship. When faced with the terrifying prospect of a federal prison cell, his self-preservation instinct violently overrode familial bonds. Preston scrambled forward, falling to his knees on the hardwood floor near the edge of the obsidian table. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with desperate, pathetic sobs. "Chloe, please," Preston wailed, clasping his trembling hands together in a frantic gesture of surrender. "Please, you cannot send that video to the FBI. I will not survive in prison. I cannot go to jail for this." I looked down at the brother who had gleefully participated in my expulsion 5 years ago, watching him debase himself completely. I did not act alone. Preston screamed, his voice reaching a hysterical, high-pitched crescendo. He turned, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at his stunned father. "He made me do it. He forced me to transfer the pension funds. He ordered me to secure that fraudulent surety bond against Lily's house. I have the emails, Chloe. I kept records of every single illegal directive he issued. I can prove he orchestrated the entire Irise violation." Richard stared at his son, his face contorting in a mixture of horror and profound disgust. "You traitorous coward!" Richard spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You are selling out your own father to save your pathetic skin." Preston ignored him entirely, focusing his desperate, weeping eyes solely on me. "I will give you everything," Chloe Preston pleaded, crawling slightly closer. "I will testify against him in federal court. I will serve as the primary witness for the prosecution. I will hand them the entire money laundering operation on a silver platter. Just give me immunity. Please grant me corporate immunity, and do not turn that video over to the feds. I will destroy him for you." I remained perfectly silent, observing the ultimate inevitable cannibalization of the Sterling bloodline. They were viciously tearing each other apart in my boardroom, desperate to survive the inferno they had ignited. The trap had yielded its final, most potent weapon, a willing, highly motivated informant positioned directly inside the criminal conspiracy. But I knew a confession delivered in a locked boardroom was insufficient to ensure the absolute unassailable destruction of Richard Sterling. I needed that confession formally documented and delivered directly into the hands of the authorities, and I had already arranged the perfect venue for that delivery. The agonizing silence in the boardroom was finally broken by a low mechanical hum emanating from the street far below. The sound, initially faint, rapidly grew in intensity, piercing the thick soundproof glass of the 60th floor windows. It was the unmistakable urgent wail of approaching sirens, a chaotic symphony of emergency vehicles converging on a single location. Richard's head snapped toward the window. He scrambled away from the table, pressing his hands against the glass, his eyes scanning the urban canyon below. The view confirmed his worst fears. A fleet of sleek black SUVs adorned with the bright flashing lights of federal law enforcement had swarmed the entrance of the Sterling Legacy Properties corporate headquarters, situated just 3 blocks away. Uniformed officers and plainclothes agents were pouring out of the vehicles, immediately establishing a secure perimeter around the building. "What is happening down there?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking panic, fully overriding his remaining arrogance. "Why are there police at my building?" I remained seated, watching the frantic activity unfold below with a cool, detached satisfaction. "They are not police," Richard, I clarified, my tone perfectly, even slicing through the rising hysteria in the room. "They are special agents from the Department of Labor, accompanied by forensic auditors from the Internal Revenue Service." I paused, allowing the gravity of those specific agencies to register in his mind. The IRS and the DOL do not conduct polite inquiries. They execute highly coordinated raids when presented with undeniable proof of severe systemic fraud, while you were busy screaming in my lobby and demanding $50 million. I continued, my gaze locking onto his terrified face. I transmitted the decrypted USB drive containing the unredacted pension ledgers directly to the federal authorities. I sent the files exactly 2 hours ago, categorized under priority whistleblower protection protocols. The agents currently raiding your headquarters possess comprehensive warrants authorizing the immediate seizure of all corporate servers, physical files, and financial records. They are actively locking down the building. Your empire is officially a federal crime scene. Preston, still kneeling on the floor, let out a sharp, terrified whimper. He realized the timeline. The authorities already possessed the evidence of the stolen retirement funds. His desperate offer to turn state's witness was largely obsolete. The feds already had the smoking gun. Richard spun away from the window, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and manic. The realization that he was trapped, completely isolated from his resources and facing imminent arrest, triggered a violent primal fight-or-flight response. He lunged toward the heavy locked double doors of the boardroom, frantically yanking on the polished brass handles. The electronic deadbolts held firm, completely unresponsive to his desperate efforts. "Let me out of here!" Richard screamed, his voice raw, tearing at his throat. He pounded his fists against the thick wood, the sound echoing hollowly in the vast space. "You cannot hold me here. I demand you unlock this door." I calmly reached forward and pressed the control button on my desk. The electronic locks disengaged with a sharp, definitive click. "I am not holding you, Richard," I stated quietly. "You are free to leave." Richard did not hesitate. He threw the heavy doors open, bursting into the frosted glass corridor. Preston scrambled to his feet, abandoning his tearful pleas, and sprinted after his father, driven by blind, unthinking panic. Marcus moved to stand beside me, his arms crossed, watching the chaotic retreat. "They are running straight toward the elevators." Marcus noted, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. I nodded, maintaining my steady gaze. Exactly as predicted. I activated the exterior surveillance feed on my secondary monitor. The high-definition cameras captured Richard and Preston sprinting down the corridor, their expensive suits disheveled, their faces flushed with frantic exertion. They reached the private bank of executive elevators, repeatedly jabbing the call buttons with trembling fingers. The digital display above the central elevator indicated a car ascending rapidly from the ground floor. Come on, Richard hissed, pacing erratically in front of the polished steel doors. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting Marcus to emerge from the boardroom and physically restrain him. The elevator chimed softly. Richard positioned himself directly in front of the doors, his body tensed, preparing to rush inside the moment they parted. He planned to descend to the parking garage, steal a vehicle, and somehow vanish before the federal net closed entirely around him. The sleek metal doors glided smoothly open. Richard took a hurried step forward, but his momentum died instantly. He froze his breath, catching painfully in his lungs, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror. The elevator was not empty. Standing shoulder to shoulder inside the spacious cabin was a heavily armed tactical team of FBI special agents, their dark windbreakers emblazoned with the unmistakable yellow lettering. They stood in perfect disciplined formation, their expressions grim and unyielding. The lead agent, a formidable woman projecting absolute authority, stepped forward, producing a thick stack of federal warrants. Richard Sterling, the lead agent, announced, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet corridor, cutting through the remaining shreds of his dignity. "You are under arrest for severe violations of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, massive wire fraud, and systemic tax evasion." Richard opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a denial, a protest any shred of his former arrogant authority. But his voice failed him. He was completely, finally broken. He raised his trembling hands in a gesture of pathetic, total surrender. Two agents moved forward with swift, uncompromising efficiency. They grabbed Richard roughly by the arms, spinning him around and slamming him against the frosted glass wall. The harsh metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the hallway. The once untouchable real estate titan was physically subdued, reduced to a cowering suspect awaiting transport. Preston, witnessing his father's brutal arrest, backed slowly away, his hands raised, tears streaming openly down his face. "I didn't do it," Preston wailed, his voice cracking hysterically. "He made me do it. I have proof. I want to cooperate." A second pair of agents swiftly intercepted Preston, securing his wrists in handcuffs, completely ignoring his frantic, sobbing pleas for immunity. The agents hauled the two men toward the elevator, treating them with the cold, clinical detachment reserved for common criminals. I watched the surveillance feed as the elevator descended, carrying them toward the ground floor lobby. The execution was flawless, but the final, most devastating component of their punishment was waiting just outside the building. The lobby of Vanguard Apex featured a massive, sprawling atrium, enclosed entirely by sheer glass walls, offering an unobstructed view of the street outside. I had not simply tipped off the federal authorities. I had simultaneously alerted every major financial news network and aggressive investigative journalist in the city. The tip detailed the exact location and time of the impending arrests, guaranteeing maximum highly public exposure. As the elevator doors opened on the ground floor and the agents marched Richard and Preston into the expansive lobby, a blinding sea of flashing camera lights erupted outside the glass facade. Dozens of reporters and television camera crews were clustered against the police barricades, their lenses pressed directly against the glass, capturing every humiliating second of the perp walk. The live broadcast feeds were instantly transmitting the images of the disgraced CEO, head-bowed, hands cuffed behind his back, stumbling toward the waiting federal transport vehicles. The arrogant empire was entirely eradicated, the destruction broadcast in high definition to the very investors and high society peers Richard had spent his life desperately trying to impress. The legacy he prized above all else was permanently reduced to a sordid, highly publicized criminal spectacle. I watched the final moments of the broadcast on my monitor, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. The long game was complete, but there were still remaining threads to sever, final accounts to settle before the ledger was completely balanced. The fallout from the federal raid swept across the Sterling family like a meticulously engineered seismic event, systematically obliterating every remaining pillar of their toxic existence. While Richard and Preston were being processed through the sterile, dehumanizing intake procedures at the Federal Detention Center, Victoria was attempting her own desperate, ill-fated escape. She had abandoned the Manhattan penthouse hours earlier, fleeing the moment the Vanguard Apex recovery team seized the Picasso. Stripped of the $8 million masterpiece, her exit strategy was severely compromised, but her primal instinct for self-preservation remained active. She packed a single, nondescript carry-on bag, stuffing it with her passport, her remaining designer jewelry, and the few high-limit credit cards she believed were still functional. She navigated the crowded terminals of John F. Kennedy International Airport, her demeanor tense and paranoid, projecting the frantic energy of a hunted fugitive rather than her usual aristocratic entitlement. She approached the first-class check-in counter for an outbound flight to Paris. She slapped her premium black card onto the counter, demanding an immediate ticket, eager to put an ocean between herself and the impending federal indictments. The airline agent swiped the card. The terminal beeped a sharp, undeniable rejection. Victoria frowned irritation, masking her rising panic. "Try it again," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly. "The magnetic strip is likely damaged. Just manually input the numbers." The agent complied, typing the digits with practiced efficiency. The result remained identical. "I apologize, madam," the agent stated, her tone shifting from accommodating to wary. "The transaction is hard declined by the issuing bank. The account indicates a severe security hold." Victoria snatched the card back, her face flushing crimson. She rummaged frantically through her designer wallet, producing 2 alternative platinum cards. She shoved them toward the agent. "Run these, both of them, now!" The agent processed the cards in rapid succession. The response was uniform across all platforms. Declined. A cold, suffocating dread settled heavily in Victoria's chest. The realization struck her with paralyzing force. The asset freeze executed by Vanguard Apex was not limited to Richard's corporate accounts. It was a comprehensive, inescapable lockdown that blanketed her personal finances as well. She was effectively stripped of all liquidity, standing in a busy airport terminal with absolutely zero purchasing power. She could not afford a first-class ticket to Paris. She could not afford a cheap motel room in Queens. She was entirely destitute. Her escalating panic, however, was swiftly interrupted by a far more pressing concern. As she stood at the counter, frantically attempting to access a mobile banking application on her phone, 2 stern-looking men approached her from behind. They wore dark suits and moved with the quiet, authoritative precision of federal law enforcement. Victoria Sterling. The taller man inquired, his voice low, but carrying absolute command. He flashed a badge bearing the insignia of the United States Customs and Border Protection. Victoria froze, her phone slipping from her trembling fingers and clattering onto the polished floor. "Yes," she managed to whisper, her aristocratic facade crumbling entirely. "Ma'am, you are attempting to board an international flight while currently named as an active person of interest in a federal investigation concerning the illegal dissipation of encumbered corporate assets." The agent explained, his gaze steely and uncompromising. "Furthermore, we have received a judicial alert regarding your attempted theft of a high-value, legally seized artwork from a distressed property. Your passport has been flagged for immediate retention. You are not leaving the country." The agents did not place her in handcuffs, avoiding a disruptive public spectacle, but they firmly grasped her arms, escorting her away from the ticketing counter and toward a secure interrogation room within the terminal. The socialite who had sneered at my existence was now reduced to a penniless suspect, detained in a sterile airport holding cell, her luxurious escape permanently aborted. Meanwhile, deep within the heavily fortified walls of the federal building in Lower Manhattan, Preston was actively ensuring his father's permanent incarceration. Separated from Richard during the booking process, Preston's cowardly survival instincts shifted into overdrive. Recognizing that the federal prosecutors possessed irrefutable evidence of the Heist violations and the corporate espionage, he desperately sought any available leverage to negotiate a reduced sentence. He found himself sitting across a metal table from 2 seasoned FBI special agents in a stark, windowless interrogation room. He was weeping openly, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. "I didn't engineer the pension fraud." Preston sobbed, his voice echoing shrilly in the small room. "He forced me to do it. He controlled everything. I was just following orders to protect the family. I have proof. I have all the emails." The lead agent leaned forward, his expression skeptical but attentive. "We already have the emails, Preston. Vanguard Apex provided a comprehensive digital dossier. We do not need your testimony to prove the ERISA violations. You need to offer us something we do not already possess if you want us to consider a cooperation agreement." Preston nodded frantically, wiping his nose with the back of his trembling hand. "I have more. I have the offshore routing codes for the shell accounts in Cyprus. I know exactly how he washed the stolen funds before bringing them back into the domestic accounts. I can give you the names of the foreign bankers who facilitated the transfers. I kept detailed records of everything. He was singing like a canary, offering up his father's most heavily guarded secrets on a silver platter, entirely willing to trade Richard's freedom for a slightly more comfortable prison sentence. He was systematically dismantling the last vestiges of the Sterling Empire from within an interrogation room, proving definitively that loyalty among parasites only extends until the host is consumed. While the Sterling family cannibalized itself in federal custody, my primary objective was securing the one innocent casualty caught in the crossfire. I sat in my penthouse maintaining a secure connection with Marcus. He had returned to his Brooklyn brownstone immediately following the arrests, prioritizing the protection of his wife above all else. "Lily is safe," Marcus reported, his deep voice radiating a profound, exhausted relief. The emergency injunction we prepared successfully blocked Preston's forged surety bond. The lien was struck from the municipal registry before it could be formalized. Our home is completely secure. The title is clear. I exhaled a long, steady breath, the residual tension knotting my shoulders finally releasing. "That is excellent news, Marcus. Has Lily processed the events of the day?" Marcus paused, the silence stretching momentarily. It was a massive shock. Seeing Richard arrested on television, it broke the illusion she had desperately clung to. But she is resilient. She understands now that the toxicity was terminal. She recognizes that you saved us from ruin. She wants to see you, Chloe, when the dust settles. "Tell her I will be here when she is ready," I replied softly, acknowledging the fragile bridge we were beginning to rebuild. But right now, she needs to distance herself entirely from the fallout. The federal prosecutors will be casting a wide net. Ensure your legal firewalls are impenetrable. "My firm is handling our isolation," Marcus assured me. "We are legally and financially severed from Richard Sterling. They cannot touch us." The operation was complete. The innocent were shielded, and the guilty were facing the absolute maximum penalty for their hubris. The financial execution was flawless. I disconnected the call with Marcus and turned my attention back to the glowing monitors. The financial news networks were locked in a continuous loop, analyzing the spectacular, unprecedented collapse of Sterling legacy properties. Pundits debated the severity of the ERISA violations, while legal experts dissected the brilliant aggressive tactics employed by the anonymous Vanguard Apex Fund. They marveled at the precision of the hostile takeover, entirely oblivious to the deeply personal vendetta fueling the acquisition. As I watched the chaotic media coverage, my secure, personal cell phone, a number known only to a select few, high-level contacts began to vibrate sharply against the mahogany desk. I glanced at the caller ID. The screen displayed a generic restricted number routing through a federal corrections facility in Manhattan. The timing was impeccable. The system allows inmates one highly monitored, closely timed phone call during the initial processing phase. Richard, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his freedom, had chosen to use his solitary lifeline to contact the daughter he had once discarded. I picked up the device, my expression hardening into an icy, unreadable mask. I swiped the screen, accepting the call, but I did not speak. I simply held the phone to my ear, waiting for the broken patriarch to beg. Chloe Richards' voice crackled through the secure connection. The booming, arrogant baritone was entirely eradicated. He sounded old, terrified, and profoundly weak. The background noise of the detention center, the slamming of heavy steel doors, the harsh commands of corrections officers echoed faintly behind him. "Chloe, please tell me you are there. I know you are listening." I remained perfectly silent, letting the heavy, suffocating silence amplify his desperation. "Please, Chloe." Richard wept, a pathetic, ragged sound that conveyed the absolute destruction of his ego. "I am in a holding cell. They took my suit. They took my watch. The prosecutors are talking about a 30-year sentence. Preston is turning state's evidence against me. He is blaming me for everything. Victoria's phone is—" The agonizing silence in my penthouse was finally broken by a low electronic hum from my secure mobile device. The screen displayed a generic, restricted number routing through a federal corrections facility in Lower Manhattan. The system allows inmates one highly monitored, closely timed phone call during their initial processing phase. Richard, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his freedom, had chosen to use his solitary lifeline to contact the daughter he discarded. I picked up the device, my expression hardening into an icy, unreadable mask. I swiped the screen, accepting the call, but I did not speak. I held the phone to my ear, waiting for the broken patriarch to beg. Chloe, Richard whispered, his voice crackling through the secure connection. The booming, arrogant baritone was entirely eradicated. He sounded old, terrified, and profoundly weak. The background noise of the detention center, the slamming of heavy steel doors, and the harsh commands of corrections officers echoed faintly behind him. "Chloe, please tell me you are there. I know you are listening." I remained perfectly silent, letting the heavy, suffocating quiet amplify his desperation. "Please, Chloe." Richard wept, a pathetic, ragged sound that conveyed the destruction of his ego. "I am in a holding cell. They took my suit. They took my watch. The prosecutors are talking about a 30-year sentence. Preston is turning state evidence against me. He is blaming me for everything." Victoria disconnected her phone. "I have no one else to call. I have nothing." The silence stretched further, becoming a weapon I wielded with devastating precision. "I know I was harsh 5 years ago," Richard pleaded, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. "I know I was wrong, but I am your father. You are blood. You cannot let me die in this place. Vanguard Apex seized $50 million from my account this morning. I know you control the fund. I know you have the money. Please, Chloe, you have to use that money to secure my bail. You have to hire a top-tier defense team to fight these charges. You can save me. You are the only one who can save my company." I let his frantic sobbing run its course until his breath hitched and he waited for my salvation. "You told me 5 years ago that I would not survive a single year without the sterling name behind me," I said, my voice echoing with the quiet, chilling finality of a monarch delivering a sentence. "You threw my business plan onto the pavement and told me I would starve in the street." Richard tried to interrupt, babbling breathless apologies. "You were wrong, Richard," I stated, slicing cleanly through his desperate noise. "I did not just survive without your name. I just liquidated it for $0. Have a pleasant life." I pressed the end call button. I accessed the security settings on my mobile device and blocked the routing number from the Federal Detention Center. The digital tether was severed. Richard ceased to be a factor in my reality. He was just a variable that had been permanently zeroed out. The real work commenced the following morning. Vanguard Apex now possessed the physical keys to the Sterling corporate headquarters. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the towering Manhattan skyscraper, stepping into the marble lobby not as a returning daughter, but as a forensic surgeon preparing to excise a terminal tumor. Marcus met me near the security desk. As the chief legal counsel for Vanguard, he carried a sleek leather briefcase containing the dissolution filings. The building was eerily quiet. The federal raid had cleared out the executive suites, leaving behind a terrified workforce of mid-level managers and administrative staff who assumed their careers were over. We rode the elevator to the top floor and convened an emergency meeting with the remaining board of directors. These were the men who had blindly rubber-stamped fraudulent ledgers for years, enjoying their lavish dividends while ignoring the rotting foundation. They sat around the obsidian table, sweating profusely, pitching frantic turnaround strategies. They wanted Vanguard to inject more capital, rebrand the firm, and resume operations. They believed the real estate portfolio could still generate significant revenue if we merely weathered the public relations scandal. I sat in the heavy leather chair at the head of the table. I let them present their charts and graphs. When they finished, I folded my hands on the polished stone surface. "We are not saving this firm," I announced, my tone extinguishing their fragile hopes instantly. "Sterling Legacy Properties is radioactive. The brand is inextricably linked to pension theft and corporate espionage. I did not acquire this entity to run it. I acquired it to tear it down to the studs. I instructed Marcus to distribute the legal packets. We were initiating a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The corporate entity would be dissolved. All physical assets, intellectual property, and real estate holdings would be sold off. The liquidation was a masterclass in swift clinical asset distribution. The $50 million clawback I had seized from Richard's primary account formed the bedrock of our recovery fund. But I wanted his personal vanity stripped bare to finance the restitution. I wanted the proceeds of his arrogance to repair the damage he had inflicted on the working class. Marcus orchestrated a rapid auction of the seized collateral. The opulent Manhattan penthouse, the site of so many toxic family dinners, was sold to a foreign technology executive within a week. The sprawling Hamptons estate went to a rival developer who planned to raze the structure and subdivide the land. The fleet of luxury vehicles, including Preston's prized sports car, hit the auction block and fetched premium prices. The revenue from these sales poured directly into a secure escrow account managed by Vanguard Apex. The United States Department of Labor anticipated a grueling, protracted legal battle to recover the stolen employee pensions. Federal regulators expected the victims to receive mere pennies on the dollar after years of draining litigation. Marcus and I bypassed the bureaucratic quagmire entirely. We scheduled a meeting with the lead federal investigators and presented them with a fully funded restitution package. We utilized the liquidated assets to replenish the retirement accounts of every single employee Richard had defrauded. 300 workers received formal notifications that their missing funds were restored in full, inclusive of the lost compounding interest. The money Richard had stolen to buy designer art and fund offshore gambling was returned directly to the administrative assistants, the project managers, and the maintenance crews who had actually built his wealth. The shockwaves of gratitude that rippled through the former workforce were profound, but I did not linger to collect their praise. I preferred the quiet satisfaction of balancing the ledger. 6 months passed. The sterling name was successfully erased from the Manhattan skyline. The corporate headquarters had been leased to a clean, reputable logistics firm. I stood on the wraparound terrace of my penthouse, the cool evening breeze brushing against my skin. The city lights glittered below a sprawling, endless grid of power commerce and hidden narratives. Marcus stepped out onto the terrace, the sliding glass door clicking softly behind him. He carried 2 crystal glasses and a bottle of rare vintage bourbon. He handed me a glass, taking his place beside me at the transparent railing. He provided a brief update on the legal fallout. Richard had accepted a plea deal to avoid a public trial, securing a 15-year sentence in a medium-security federal facility. Preston, despite his frantic cooperation, received an 8-year sentence for his role in the corporate espionage and mortgage fraud. Victoria was currently residing in a cramped, unrenovated studio apartment in Queens, drowning in civil litigation from her former high society acquaintances who were demanding repayment for various fraudulent charity schemes she had orchestrated. "The municipal registry processed the final paperwork this afternoon," Marcus said, pouring a measure of the amber liquid into my glass. "The Vanguard Housing Initiative is officially a registered nonprofit entity. Instead of absorbing the remaining liquidated capital into my own investment portfolio, we had channeled the leftover millions into a newly established philanthropic fund. The initiative was dedicated to developing sustainable, affordable housing units in underserved Brooklyn neighborhoods. We had taken the financial remains of a predatory real estate syndicate and transformed them into an engine for genuine community stabilization." I raised my glass, the crystal catching the ambient light of the city. We clinked our glasses together, a resonant, clear sound that marked the true conclusion of the war. People often believe that ultimate retaliation requires claiming the throne of your enemy and ruling their kingdom. They assume victory means wearing the crown they coveted. I realized, looking out over the city, I now helped shape that true power operates on a different frequency. The most profound vengeance is not stealing the throne. It is smashing the throne to pieces, melting the gold, and using the metal to forge a legacy that actually means something. Disconnected. I have no one else to call. I have absolutely nothing. The silence stretched further, a weapon I wielded with devastating precision. "I know I was harsh 5 years ago," Richard pleaded, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. "I know I was wrong, but I am your father. You are blood. You cannot let me die in this place." "Vanguard Apex seized $50 million from my account this morning. I know you control the fund. I know you have the money. Please, Chloe, you have to use that money to secure my bail. You have to hire a top-tier defense team to fight these charges. You can save me. You are the only one who can save my company and my life. Please save me." The bourbon warmed my throat, a sharp, clean burn that perfectly matched the clarity of the night air. I looked down at the sprawling, illuminated grid of Manhattan, a city built on ambition, ruthlessness, and the relentless pursuit of power. For 5 years I had navigated those undercurrents, building a silent empire, while the men who shared my blood constructed a brittle facade of arrogance. Now their facade was reduced to dust, swept away by the very reality they refused to acknowledge. As I stood on the terrace alongside the only family member I truly respected, the magnitude of the transformation settled over me. The journey from a discarded daughter standing on a freezing sidewalk to the undisputed architect of their financial annihilation illuminated several undeniable truths. First, I learned that true power never requires volume. Richard spent his entire life shouting his importance in boardrooms, relying on intimidation and the illusion of wealth to force compliance. He believed that the loudest voice in the room controlled the narrative, but real authority operates in the silence between the screams. It is built in the shadows, forged through meticulous data analysis, quiet acquisitions, and the disciplined execution of strategy. You do not need to announce your strength. You simply need to structure the environment so that when you finally move, your opponents are already cornered. Second, the concept of familial loyalty is frequently weaponized by toxic individuals to demand unconditional submission. They rely on the biological tether to extract resources, excuse their abuse, and force you to absorb their liabilities. Cutting that tether is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate necessity for survival. When people who share your name treat you as a disposable asset, your only obligation is to yourself. Removing yourself from their blast radius allows you to view their inevitable collapse not as a tragedy, but as a mathematical certainty you can leverage. Finally, the most satisfying vengeance is never destructive. It is transformative. If I had simply seized Richard's company and maintained his predatory real estate practices, I would have just become a more efficient version of the monster I defeated. By liquidating his toxic empire and reallocating the stolen funds to restore the pensions of the working class and build affordable housing, I neutralized his legacy entirely. I took the capital generated by his greed and weaponized it for good, ensuring that the sterling name was not just erased, but overwritten by something infinitely more valuable. I took a final sip from my glass, the cool wind carrying away the last remnants of the past. The ledger was balanced, the liabilities were settled, and the future was entirely mine to underwrite. If you have ever had to build your own empire from the ashes of a toxic family's betrayal, drop your story in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to Blueberry Revenge for more stories of absolute uncompromised